Welcome to this Soundscape Books recording of Crow's Revenge, a crime thriller by Vivian Black, presented as an exclusive audiobook. Like and subscribe for more. Enjoy.
Crow's Revenge, Chapter 1, The Weight of Inheritance. The call came at 3:17 a.m., cutting through the sterile silence of Katrina Vance's Manhattan penthouse like a blade through silk. She knew, even before her trembling fingers found the phone in the darkness, that this moment would cleave her life into a stark before and after. The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, Blackwood Creek's only physician, and his words carried the weight of inevitability she'd been dreading for years. "I'm sorry, Katrina, your father." The bridge collapsed during the storm. "We found him in the creek at dawn." Arthur Vance. The last true advocate Blackwood Creek had ever known, according to those who still remembered when justice meant more than a campaign slogan. And now, like so many truths in that moss-covered tombstone of a town, he was gone. Katrina had built her career on precision, each argument crafted like a Swiss timepiece, every word calculated for maximum impact. But now, standing in her climate-controlled sanctuary overlooking Central Park, she found herself reduced to a single, guttural sound that might have been a sob or a curse. Her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a woman unraveling. Dark hair escaping its usual severe ponytail, hazel eyes wide with shock, her unconscious habit of twisting her father's old signet ring. The only piece of Blackwood Creek she'd ever allowed herself to keep, now frantic on her finger. "The ravens know when death comes calling," her father used to say, quoting some half-remembered local superstition. 3 cause for a natural passing, 7 for murder. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, Katrina could swear she heard the distant sound of corvids, though the nearest thing to wildlife in her neighborhood was the occasional pigeon. The memories came in waves during the sleepless hours that followed, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. 7-year-old Katrina, perched on her father's shoulders during the Founders' Day parade, watching the way people's faces changed when they saw Arthur Vance, respect mingling with something that might have been fear. 12-year-old Katrina, hiding behind the study door as her father shouted into the phone about corrupt land deals and bought judges, his usually gentle voice transformed into something fierce and dangerous. "They think because we're small, we don't matter," he'd told her once, after a particularly brutal day in court where he'd lost a case everyone knew he should have won. "But that's exactly when we matter most, Katie girl. When the wolves circle the flock, someone has to stand in the gap." She'd fled that gap at 18, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of Blackwood Creek's expectations and her father's impossible righteousness. Harvard Law, then a prestigious firm, then partnership, each achievement another mile between herself and the town that had shaped her. She'd built herself into exactly what her father had never been: successful, wealthy, untouchable, and utterly, completely alone. The drive to Blackwood Creek took 8 hours through increasingly desolate country, each mile stripping away another layer of the armor she'd so carefully constructed. Her sleek BMW, usually her pride, began to feel ostentatious against the backdrop of weathered farmhouses and rusted mailboxes. By the time she reached the county line, marked by a sign so faded it was barely legible, she felt like an imposter in her own story. The town itself looked smaller than her memories suggested, as if 20 years of absence had somehow diminished its physical presence. Main Street was a collection of false-fronted buildings that might have been charming in a different context, if they hadn't been chosen as the setting for whatever tragedy had befallen her father. The Iron Stag Diner's neon sign flickered erratically, casting intermittent shadows across cracked asphalt. The courthouse, where Arthur had fought his last battles, loomed like a brick monument to futility. But it was the ravens that stopped her cold. They lined the power lines like notes on some macabre musical staff, dozens of them, their black eyes tracking her progress through town. In the city, she might have dismissed them as coincidence. Here, with her father's voice echoing in her memory and the weight of childhood superstitions pressing against her rational mind, they felt like harbingers. 7 cause for murder. She found herself counting, then forced herself to stop. Arthur Vance had raised a daughter who believed in evidence, not omens. Still, her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she turned toward Whisperwind Cemetery. She wasn't prepared for Ezra Blackthorne. The elderly man emerged from behind a weathered mausoleum as she parked, moving with the careful precision of someone whose bones remembered better days. His clothes were shabby but clean, his white hair wild beneath a battered fedora that looked older than she was. But his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter, held a recognition that made her stomach clench. "Katrina Vance," he said, not a question but a statement loaded with history. "You've got your daddy's stubborn chin and your mama's fire in your eyes, always did, even as a little thing." She remembered him now, Ezra Blackthorne, the town's self-appointed keeper of secrets and stories. He'd been ancient when she was a child, dispensing candy and local legends in equal measure from his position on the courthouse steps. The fact that he was still alive seemed to violate several laws of nature. "Mr. Blackthorne," she inclined her head, muscle memory of childhood politeness overriding her adult wariness. "I didn't expect. That is, I'm surprised to see you here." His laugh was a dry rustle, like wind through dead leaves. "Where else would I be, child? Your daddy was the last of the old guard, the last one who remembered what this town used to be before." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything and nothing. "Before the shadows got so long, they swallowed the light." "What do you mean?" But Ezra was already shuffling away, pausing only to call back over his shoulder. "Your daddy never believed in accidents, Katie girl. Neither should you. The ravens have been gathering for days, and they only do that when the natural order's been disturbed." She wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a senile old man, but the sight of the birds, more of them now, perched on tombstones and fence posts like an army of judgment, made that impossible. The funeral itself defied every expectation she'd harbored during the long drive home. Instead of the traditional graveside service she'd anticipated, she found herself part of something that felt older, stranger, more deeply rooted in Blackwood Creek's peculiar soil. The gathering was small, perhaps 20 people, but their arrangement around Arthur's grave followed no pattern she recognized from other funerals she'd attended. They stood in a rough circle, and in the center, beside the simple wooden casket Arthur had apparently requested, was a collection of objects that made Katrina's breath catch. His old law books, yes, but also stones from the creek bed, feathers, raven feathers, she realized with a shiver, and what looked like letters tied with black ribbon. Pastor Williams, a nervous man who kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting trouble, cleared his throat. "Arthur Vance left specific instructions," he began, his voice carrying poorly in the heavy air. "He wanted what he called a proper Blackwood Creek farewell. Says here we're to speak his deeds aloud, so they can't be forgotten or altered by those who might wish to rewrite history." The first speaker was Alara Bell, Katrina realized, though age had silvered her hair and carved lines around her gentle eyes. She stepped forward with the measured grace of someone performing a ritual. "Arthur Vance defended my flower shop when City Hall tried to seize it for eminent domain," Lara said, her voice clear in the stillness. "He worked for free, because he said beauty had a right to exist in this world, and my flowers were proof of it." Others followed, each testimony building a portrait of her father that was both familiar and startling. Arthur the Crusader, yes, but also Arthur the protector of small things, the defender of the powerless, the man who'd apparently made enemies of some very dangerous people. As the testimonies continued, Katrina became aware of another presence at the ceremony's edge. The crows, she recognized them from childhood stories and adult rumors, stood in a loose formation beneath the ancient oaks. Their leader, a man whose dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the gathering, watched with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Ryder Blackwood, if the family resemblance to his legendary father was any indication. Why would a biker gang attend her father's funeral? What connection could Arthur Vance, pillar of legal propriety, have had with Blackwood Creek's most notorious residents? The questions multiplied as the service reached its climax. Following Arthur's written instructions, each mourner placed an object on his casket, stones, flowers, personal mementos, until it resembled some ancient shrine more than a Christian burial. The ravens, meanwhile, had grown silent, dozens of them perched in the surrounding trees like witnesses to proceedings that predated their faith by centuries. Just as Pastor Williams began the closing prayer, Sheriff Gideon Thorne materialized beside Katrina with the uncanny timing of a predator who'd been watching from cover. "Katrina Vance," he said, his voice honey-smooth with just an edge of steel. "My sincerest condolences. Your father was a unique man. We'll miss his particular brand of civic engagement." The words themselves were innocuous enough, but something in his tone, in the calculating way his eyes moved from her face to the crows and back again, set every instinct she'd honed in a decade of high-stakes litigation screaming warnings. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, matching his measured tone while her mind raced to categorize the threat he represented. "I understand you were among the first to respond when they found him. Tragic thing, that old bridge." Thorne's smile never wavered, but she caught the flash of something cold behind his eyes. "Been meaning to get it repaired for years. Just shows how quickly things can change in a small town, especially for those who aren't familiar with local conditions." The threat was delicate, wrapped in concern and civic responsibility, but unmistakable. "Don't dig. Don't ask questions. Don't disturb the peace we've worked so hard to maintain." "I imagine it does," Katrina replied, her fingers finding her father's signet ring again. "I'm only here to settle his affairs. I'll be returning to my practice as soon as possible." It was meant to be a deflection, a promise of non-interference. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't true. The ravens had stopped cawing, she realized. The entire cemetery had fallen silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Of course," Thorne said, his smile widening. "Well, if you need anything during your stay, please don't hesitate. My office is always open to help our citizens navigate any difficulties they might encounter." He tipped his hat and departed, but the menace lingered like smoke in still air. The Vance homestead stood exactly where she remembered it, a Victorian dowager empress fallen on hard times. Paint peeled from its gingerbread trim, weeds choked the one-sprout garden, and several of the shutters hung at drunken angles. But the bones were solid, the foundation strong. Like the man who'd lived there, it had weathered decades of neglect and attack, but remained fundamentally unbroken. Katrina sat in her car for long minutes, studying the house that had shaped her childhood, before finally forcing herself to get out. The front door key was where it had always been, under the loose stone beside the steps. A small-town trust that would have horrified her Manhattan security consultant. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light, and the air carried the scent of old paper, pipe tobacco, and something else. Something sharp and metallic that might have been fear. The living room looked much as she remembered. Threadbare Persian rugs, bookcases that climbed to the ceiling, the old roll-top desk where Arthur had worked when he brought cases home. But there were new additions, too, she realized as her eyes adjusted. Maps pinned to the walls, their surfaces covered with colored pins and connecting strings that suggested months of investigation. Newspaper clippings, some yellowed with age, others recent enough that the ink might still be damp. And photographs, dozens of them, showing faces she half remembered from childhood and others that were completely unfamiliar. In the center of it all, written in her father's careful hand on a piece of hotel stationery, was a single sentence that made her blood run cold. "They think I don't know about the Riverbend acquisition, but some secrets have a way of surfacing, like bodies in the creek." The note was dated 3 days before his death. As she stood there, surrounded by the evidence of her father's final investigation, Katrina heard it, the sound that would haunt her dreams for weeks to come. 7 distinct caws from the ravens outside, harsh and deliberate in the gathering dusk. 7 caws for murder. Her father's voice, carried on the evening wind, and suddenly Katrina Vance knew with absolute certainty that she would not be returning to Manhattan. Not yet. Not until she understood why Arthur Vance had died, and why Sheriff Thorne was so eager to see his daughter leave town. The weight of inheritance, she realized, wasn't measured in property or possessions. It was measured in unfinished business, in questions that demanded answers, in the terrible responsibility of being the last person willing to ask them. Outside, Blackwood Creek flowed on toward the sea, carrying its secrets in the darkness. But some secrets, Arthur had taught her, were too important to stay buried. And some daughters were too stubborn to let their father's killers sleep easy in their beds. Chapter 2, Echoes in the Creek. The ravens had not left. Katrina woke to their cawing outside her childhood bedroom window, a harsh symphony that seemed to echo the throbbing in her temples. She'd spent half the night studying her father's makeshift investigation wall, her legal mind automatically categorizing evidence, cross-referencing dates, building connections between the pins and strings that mapped Arthur's final case. The other half she'd spent lying awake, listening to the house settle around her like an old body finding comfort in familiar aches. Now, with dawn painting the floorboards in shades of amber and regret, she understood why her father had always risen before sunrise. In the morning light, Blackwood Creek looked different, not softer, exactly, but more honest. The shadows that concealed so much during the day retreated, leaving the town exposed in all its contradictions. She dressed carefully in a charcoal suit that had cost more than most Blackwood Creek residents made in a month, then immediately reconsidered. Her father's investigation wall included photographs of locals, and she recognized the wariness in their faces. They'd learned not to trust outsiders, especially ones who looked like they had money and opinions in equal measure. Instead, she chose dark jeans and a navy blazer, professional but approachable. Arthur had taught her that the best lawyers knew when to intimidate and when to invite confidence. This morning, she needed people to talk to her. But first, she needed to understand what Arthur had been investigating. The note she'd found the night before, "They think I don't know about the Riverbend acquisition, but some secrets have a way of surfacing," like bodies in the creek, had been written on stationery from the Mountain View Lodge, a motel 40 miles away in Millfield. Why had her father been there? More importantly, what had he learned that made him write such a cryptic warning? Katrina spread the contents of Arthur's desk across the dining room table, creating her own version of the investigation wall. Her legal training kicked in automatically: chronological order, correlation analysis, pattern recognition. It was a process she'd perfected over years of complex corporate cases, but this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. The earliest documents dated back 6 months. Land records from the county assessor's office showing a series of property transfers along Blackwood Creek. Small parcels, seemingly unconnected, but Arthur had highlighted them in yellow and connected them with red ink to form a rough corridor, following the creek's path from its source in the mountains to where it emptied into the river 20 miles downstream. Each transfer involved a different company: Riverbend Holdings, Creek Development LLC, Mountain Vista Properties. But when Katrina ran the corporate registrations through her phone's legal database app, a habit that had served her well in Manhattan, the ownership structures began to blur together like watercolors in the rain. Shell companies within shell companies, registered addresses that led to vacant lots or post office boxes, incorporating agents who specialized in corporate anonymity. It was a technique she knew well from her white-collar defense work, but seeing it deployed in Blackwood Creek felt like finding an exotic disease in her childhood garden. "Somebody's playing a very sophisticated game," she murmured to the empty house, her voice echoing off walls that had heard Arthur make the same observation in the months before his death. A sound from the kitchen made her freeze, the distinctive groan of the back door's hinges, a sound that had announced her homecoming from school for 12 years of her life. Her father had never fixed that hinge, claiming it was better than any security system. "Hello," she called, slipping her phone into her blazer pocket and wishing she'd thought to check whether Arthur kept any weapons in the house. "It's just me, dear," came a familiar voice, followed by the appearance of Alara Bell carrying a covered dish and wearing the same expression of gentle determination she'd shown at the funeral. "I brought you some breakfast. You probably didn't think to stock the kitchen." Lara was right. Katrina had been surviving on convenience store coffee and granola bars since arriving. The older woman bustled into the kitchen with the confidence of someone who'd been welcome in this house for decades, and the smell of homemade biscuits and honey butter soon filled the air. "I should have asked before entering," Lara said as they settled at the kitchen table with steaming mugs of coffee that actually tasted like something other than burnt water. "But Arthur always said his door was open to friends, and I suppose old habits." It's fine, Katrina assured her, though something in Lara's manner suggested this wasn't entirely a social call. The older woman's eyes kept darting toward the dining room, where Arthur's investigation materials were spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. He was working very hard these last few months, Lara said carefully, following Katrina's gaze. Staying up late, making phone calls to places far from here, he seemed troubled more than usual. Usual? Lara sighed, suddenly looking every one of her 60-odd years. Your father never could leave well enough alone, dear. It's what made him a wonderful lawyer and a dangerous man to know. When he got hold of something that didn't seem right, he'd worry at it like a dog with a bone. Katrina leaned forward, recognizing the opening she'd been hoping for. What had he gotten hold of, Lara? What was he investigating? For a moment, Lara's face went carefully blank, an expression Katrina recognized from hostile witnesses in corporate depositions. Then the older woman seemed to reach a decision. Come with me, she said, rising from the table. There's something I need to show you. Lara led her not to the investigation wall or Arthur's study, but to the living room piano, an ancient upright that had belonged to Katrina's grandmother and hadn't been properly tuned in decades. Katrina had inherited her mother's tin ear and had never showed much interest in the instrument, but Arthur had always insisted it stay in the family. Your father was sentimental about this old thing, Lara said, running her fingers over the scarred wood. Said it reminded him of better times, when this house was full of music and laughter. She pressed down on the keys in a simple melody, Für Elise, played slowly and with obvious care. On the surface, it seemed like nothing more than a fond gesture, a way of honoring Arthur's memory. But Katrina's legal instincts, trained to notice discrepancies and hidden meanings, caught something else. Lara's fingers weren't just playing notes, they were pressing them in a specific sequence that had nothing to do with Beethoven. E, D sharp, E, D sharp, E, B, D, C. The piano responded not just with music, but with a soft mechanical click from somewhere inside the bench. Lara lifted the seat, revealing a hidden compartment that definitely hadn't been part of the original design. He had it modified last year, Lara explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Said lawyers needed to think like criminals sometimes, and criminals always had hideouts. Inside the compartment was a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by frequent handling. Katrina opened it with trembling fingers, half expecting another cryptic note or map. Instead, she found photographs. Dozens of them, clearly taken with a long-range lens from concealed positions. Men in expensive suits shaking hands with Sheriff Thorne. Documents changing hands in parking lots and dimly lit restaurants. License plates, faces, timestamps, all the elements of surveillance operation that belonged in a federal investigation, not a small-town lawyer's private files. But it was the last photograph that made her blood run cold. Arthur Vance, standing on the old bridge that had claimed his life, deep in conversation with a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow. The timestamp showed the photo was taken the day before Arthur's death, and even in the grainy image, she could see the tension in her father's posture, the way he held himself when he knew he was walking into danger. The shadowed man was handing Arthur something, an envelope or document, and their body language suggested this wasn't a friendly exchange. There was something predatory in the stranger's stance, something that made every instinct Katrina had developed in years of reading hostile witnesses scream warnings. "Who is this man?" she asked, though something in her chest already knew the answer wouldn't be good. Lara's face had gone pale. "I don't know his name, but I've seen him around town, always with Sheriff Thorne's people. Arthur called him the courier. Said he was the one who carried messages from the real power behind all this." The real power? Before Lara could answer, the sound of motorcycle engines rumbled through the morning air, not one or two bikes, but several, their deep-throated roar announcing the approach of Blackwood Creek's most notorious residents. Through the living room window, Katrina watched as a convoy of Harley-Davidsons pulled up outside the house, their riders wearing leather vests marked with the distinctive crow insignia she remembered from childhood warnings. The lead rider dismounted with fluid grace, removing his helmet to reveal the same dark eyes that had watched her father's funeral with such intensity. Ryder Blackwood stood 6 feet of controlled power on her front lawn, his gaze moving from the house to the surrounding street with the alertness of someone who expected trouble. Behind him, 4 other crows waited in formation, engines still running, ready for a quick departure. He wasn't here for a social call. "What does he want?" Katrina asked, though part of her already knew. In a town where secrets flowed like tributaries into the main current of corruption, everyone eventually ended up downstream from everyone else. Lara was already moving toward the back door, her face tight with fear. "I should go. This isn't. You shouldn't be seen with me when they're here." "Wait," Katrina called, but the older woman was already disappearing through the kitchen, the back door's familiar hinges groaning her departure. In seconds, Katrina was alone with her father's photographs and the sound of boots approaching her front door. The knock, when it came, was polite but insistent. Katrina took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door to face whatever Ryder Blackwood had come to discuss. He was bigger up close than he'd appeared at the cemetery, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill available space. His dark hair was longer than current fashion, his jaw shadowed with stubble that suggested he hadn't slept much more than she had. But it was his eyes that held her attention, intelligent, assessing, and carrying a weariness that seemed at odds with his apparent youth. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried traces of an accent she couldn't place. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." It wasn't what she'd expected from the leader of a motorcycle gang, and her confusion must have shown on her face. "We need to talk," he continued, glancing over his shoulder at his waiting men. "There are things about your father's death that you need to understand, things that might keep you alive long enough to get justice for him." Behind him, one of the crows, a massive man with scarred knuckles and intelligent eyes, nodded almost imperceptibly. The gesture carried weight, as if he was vouching for his leader's words. "And why would you want to help me?" Katrina asked, her legal training making her probe for motivation, even as every survival instinct screamed at her to either slam the door or invite them all inside. Ryder's smile was grim. "Because, counselor, we're probably the only people in Blackwood Creek who want the truth about Arthur Vance as much as you do. The difference is, we know who killed him." The morning air seemed to still around them, even the ravens falling silent as if the very town was holding its breath. Katrina found herself thinking about the photograph of her father on the bridge, about Ezra Blackthorne's warnings, about the investigation wall that mapped a conspiracy she was only beginning to understand. "Come inside," she said, stepping back from the doorway. "But just you. Your men can wait outside." Ryder nodded to his crew and followed her into the house, his presence immediately making the familiar rooms feel smaller and somehow more charged. He paused at the dining room table, studying Arthur's investigation materials with the practiced eye of someone who understood what he was seeing. "Your old man was closer than anyone thought," he said finally. "Close enough to get himself killed anyway." "By whom?" "The same people who have been squeezing this town like a vice for the last 20 years, Ryder replied, picking up one of the property transfer documents. "The same people who think they can make problems disappear by throwing them off bridges." He turned to face her fully, and in his dark eyes, she saw something that matched the fire she felt burning in her own chest, a hunger for justice that had nothing to do with law books or courtrooms. "The question is, Ms. Vance, are you ready to finish what your father started? Because if you are, I can tell you exactly who killed Arthur Vance and why. But once you know, there's no going back to your safe life in the city. Once you know, you're either part of the solution or you're the next body in the creek." Outside, Blackwood Creek flowed on toward the river, carrying its secrets and its sins in the morning light. But inside the Vance homestead, 2 unlikely allies were about to forge a partnership that would either save the town or destroy them both. The echoes in the creek, Katrina was beginning to understand, weren't just sounds bouncing off rocks and trees. They were the voices of everyone who tried to speak truth in this valley and been silenced for their trouble. It was time to make sure those voices were finally heard. Chapter 3: The Sheriff's Shadow. 25 years earlier, the first time Gideon Thorne killed a man, he was 19 years old and desperate enough to believe that desperation justified anything. The man had been a federal investigator. too curious about certain shipping manifests coming through the old mill district, too persistent in his questions about who really controlled the flow of commerce in Blackwood Creek. Young Gideon had been ordered to handle the situation by Silas Vane's father, a man whose shadow had loomed over the valley even then, whose whispered name could make grown men check their locks twice before sleeping. The killing had been messy, amateurish, the kind of mistake that should have ended with Gideon in prison or dead in a ditch. Instead, it had made him indispensable. Clean work leaves no witnesses, old Marcus Vane had told him afterward, studying the bloody aftermath with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock. Messy work leaves grateful allies. You killed a federal agent, boy. That makes you mine forever, because it makes you unemployable anywhere else. Now, Sheriff Gideon Thorne sat in his office 25 years later, staring at a photograph of Arthur Vance's body being pulled from Blackwood Creek, and wondered when exactly he'd stopped feeling sick about the necessary deaths. When had the desperate 19-year-old been buried so completely under layers of compromise and complicity that even he couldn't find the grave? Sheriff, the voice belonged to Deputy Patricia Morse, his administrative assistant and the closest thing he had to a confessor. She'd been with him for 15 years, long enough to read his moods like weather patterns, smart enough to know which questions not to ask. The reports from the bridge collapse are ready for your signature. Patricia was 43, divorced, pragmatic, and absolutely loyal, not because she believed in his cause, but because she understood the mathematics of survival in Blackwood Creek. She kept his calendar, managed his correspondence, and occasionally helped dispose of evidence that might complicate his narrative of events. In return, he ensured her ex-husband stayed in prison and her teenage daughter stayed safe at the private school 2 counties away. Any complications? Thorne asked, signing his name to documents that would officially close the investigation into Arthur Vance's death. Accidental drowning following structural failure of a neglected bridge. Case closed. The daughter's been asking questions at the records office, Patricia replied, her tone carefully neutral. Brenda called this morning. Says she's been requesting property transfers, business registrations, anything related to development along the creek. Thorne's pen paused above the signature line. Katrina Vance. He'd seen her at the funeral, of course, too composed, too observant, with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's fire in her eyes. He'd hoped his warning would be sufficient, that she'd take her inheritance and disappear back to whatever glittering city had claimed her. But Arthur's daughter was proving to have inherited more than money. And the Crows? Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Ryder Blackwood was seen at the Vance homestead this morning, stayed inside for nearly an hour. That was troublesome. The Crows were useful muscle, reliable transporters, predictably motivated by the right combination of threats and incentives. But Ryder Blackwood had always been a wild card, too intelligent for his own good, too willing to question orders that didn't align with his personal code. If he was talking to Arthur's daughter, schedule a meeting, Thorne decided. Something public, casual, the diner perhaps, this evening. With the Vance woman? With both of them. Let's see what kind of alliance they think they're building. Patricia made a note in her meticulous shorthand, but Thorne caught the slight tension in her shoulders. She developed that tell over the years, a physical manifestation of moral discomfort that appeared whenever his orders crossed certain lines. It was useful information. Patricia's conscience was a more reliable barometer of public opinion than any poll. Problem, Patricia? No, sir, just. Arthur Vance was a good man. His daughter doesn't deserve whatever's coming. None of us get what we deserve, Thorne replied, returning his attention to the paperwork that would bury Arthur's investigation along with Arthur himself. We get what we earn, and what we can live with afterward. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the familiar acid burn of a conscience that refused to die completely, no matter how many compromises he fed it. Meanwhile, the Iron Stag diner Katrina had chosen the diner not for its food, which remained as questionable as she remembered from childhood, but for its location at the intersection of Main Street and Creek Road, where she could observe the flow of traffic while remaining visible to anyone who might be looking for her. After Ryder's revelations that morning, she developed a healthy paranoia about being caught alone in dark places. The conversation with the biker leader had lasted 3 hours and left her feeling like she'd been pulled through a hurricane of information. Ryder knew things, specific, detailed things, about her father's investigation, about the network of corruption that had strangled Blackwood Creek, about the careful choreography of violence that kept the system running smoothly. "Your father wasn't just investigating land deals," he'd told her, spreading his own photographs across Arthur's dining room table. "He was mapping the entire pipeline. Drugs, weapons, money, all of it flowing through this valley like tributaries feeding into the main current." The photographs were damning. Sheriff Thorne accepting envelopes of cash, mysterious shipments moving through the old mill district, meetings between local officials and men in expensive suits who didn't belong in a town this size. But the most shocking revelation had been Ryder's personal connection to the conspiracy. "The Crows aren't volunteers," he'd explained, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "We're conscripts. Thorne has evidence of past activities, things that would put half my men in federal prison. He uses that leverage to make us his delivery service, his muscle when persuasion isn't enough." It was a brilliant system, Katrina had to admit with professional reluctance. Use the local biker gang as both criminal asset and scapegoat, ensuring their complicity through blackmail while maintaining plausible deniability if anything went wrong. No wonder Arthur had been so careful in his investigation. He hadn't just been fighting corruption, he'd been dismantling a machine designed to protect itself through fear and compromised loyalty. Now, sitting in the diner's familiar vinyl booth, Katrina waited for Ryder to join her for their planned meeting. They'd agreed to coordinate their information, to build a case that might actually stick in a courtroom that wasn't controlled by Sheriff Thorne's influence. The plan felt desperate and likely suicidal, but it was the only plan they had. "Ms. Vance." The voice was elderly but firm, belonging to a man she hadn't noticed approaching her table. He was perhaps 70, impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit that belonged to an earlier era, carrying a worn leather briefcase that suggested professional rather than social purposes. "I'm Judge Harold Whitmore," he continued, extending a hand that trembled slightly with age but gripped with surprising strength. "Retired. I knew your father well, and I believe we need to speak." Katrina gestured to the empty seat across from her, her mind racing. She'd heard of Whitmore. Arthur had mentioned him occasionally, usually with respect tinged by frustration. He'd been the district's chief judge for 30 years before retiring to write legal memoirs that no one read. "Your father came to see me 3 weeks before he died," Whitmore said without preamble, his voice low enough to be lost in the diner's ambient noise. He was frightened, which was unusual for Arthur. But he was also determined, which was not unusual at all. The old judge opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope, sliding it across the scarred formica table. "He asked me to give this to you if anything happened to him. Said you'd know what to do with it when the time came." Katrina's hands shook slightly as she opened the envelope, finding inside a single brass key and a handwritten note in her father's familiar script. "Katie girl, if you're reading this, then they finally worked up the courage to silence me." The key opens a safe deposit box at First National in Millfield, box 247. Inside you'll find evidence that will burn this whole rotten system to the ground, but only if you're brave enough to light the match. The choice is yours, as it should be. But remember what I always told you. Sometimes the only way to stop a wildfire is to set a backfire. "All my love, Dad." "He was protecting you," Judge Whitmore said quietly, watching her face as she absorbed the implications. "By keeping you ignorant, by letting you build your life somewhere safe. But protection only works if the protector survives." "What kind of evidence?" Katrina asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. "The kind that gets federal prosecutors very excited and local sheriffs very dead," Whitmore replied with grim satisfaction. Arthur spent 5 years building that case, documenting every transaction, every payoff, every convenient coincidence. He knew he was signing his own death warrant, but he also knew someone had to be willing to sign it. Before Katrina could respond, the diner's front door chimed, admitting Sheriff Gideon Thorne and 2 of his deputies. Thorne's eyes swept the room with practiced authority before settling on her table with what might have been surprise, or might have been calculation masquerading as surprise. Judge Whitmore rose smoothly, his movement casual but purposeful. "Think carefully about what I've told you, Ms. Vance. And remember, in chess, the most powerful piece is often the one your opponent doesn't see coming." He left through the diner's back exit, disappearing so smoothly that other diners barely noticed his departure. But Thorne noticed. His eyes tracked the judge's movement before returning to Katrina with increased interest. "Ms. Vance," Thorne said, approaching her table with the confident stride of a man on his own territory. "Mind if I join you? I was hoping we could chat about your plans in Blackwood Creek." It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. Thorne slid into the booth across from her, dismissing his deputies with a subtle gesture that sent them to the counter for coffee and pie. Privacy, but with witnesses nearby. Reasonable conversation, but with the implicit threat of official force. "I trust you're finding everything you need to settle your father's affairs," Thorne began, his tone perfectly calibrated between concern and authority. "I know this must be a difficult time." "Difficult in unexpected ways," Katrina replied, slipping the envelope into her purse with movements she hoped appeared casual. "I'm discovering my father led a more complex life than I realized." Thorne's smile was warm and understanding, and completely failed to reach his eyes. Arthur was passionate about his work, sometimes to the point of obsession. Small-town life can seem quiet to outsiders, but it has its own currents, its own complications. Not everyone appreciates an outsider's perspective on local matters. The threat was so smoothly delivered it might have been a genuine warning, but Katrina's legal training had taught her to listen for what wasn't being said as much as what was. "I imagine that's true," she agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "Though I've always found that legal matters tend to be fairly universal. Fraud is fraud, regardless of jurisdiction. Murder is murder, whether it happens in Manhattan or Millfield." The word hung in the air between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation being rapidly recalibrated. "Of course," he said after a moment that stretched slightly too long. "Though I hope you're not suggesting that Arthur's death was anything other than the tragic accident our investigation concluded it was. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The subtext was clear. Don't push. Don't dig. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. But Katrina had spent years in conference rooms with men who used politeness as a weapon, had learned to recognize the smell of fear beneath expensive cologne and practice charm. Sheriff Thorne was afraid, not of her exactly, but of what she might uncover, what she might prove. "I suppose that would depend on what evidence might surface," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. "Evidence has a way of clarifying difficult situations." Thorne leaned forward slightly, his bulk making the booth suddenly feel cramped. "Ms. Vance, I want to be very clear about something. Blackwood Creek is a peaceful community. We value that peace, we protect it. Sometimes that means helping visitors understand that certain questions are better left unasked, certain stones better left unturned. And what happens to visitors who don't understand that lesson?" His smile widened, becoming something predatory and completely divorced from warmth. "Well, accidents do happen. Bridges collapse. Roads become treacherous in bad weather. Sometimes people just disappear. It's tragic, really, but the wilderness around here can be unforgiving to those who don't know its dangers." The threat was explicit now, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who'd made similar threats many times before. But it was also a mistake, the kind of overconfidence that had destroyed more than one defendant in Katrina's courtroom experience. "That's a very colorful way of describing what I assume are statistical anomalies," she replied, her voice taking on the crisp professional tone that had intimidated corporate executives and federal prosecutors. "Though I have to say, Sheriff, in my experience, people who threaten lawyers tend to discover that lawyers have friends in very useful places." She gathered her purse and stood, looking down at Thorne with the cool assessment of a predator recognizing another predator. "Thank you for the friendly advice. I'll be sure to keep it in mind as I continue settling my father's affairs. As she walked toward the diner's exit, she could feel Thorne's gaze boring into her back like a physical weight. But she also felt something else, the presence of other eyes, watching from different angles. Through the window, she caught sight of Ryder Blackwood astride his motorcycle, his dark eyes fixed on the diner with an intensity that suggested he'd witnessed the entire confrontation. Behind Ryder, barely visible in the shadows between buildings, she glimpsed other figures, his men, positioned to observe and, if necessary, to act. The crows were watching, waiting, ready to move if Thorne's threats moved from words to action. Outside, the afternoon sun painted Blackwood Creek in deceptively peaceful colors, but Katrina could feel the currents of conflict flowing beneath the surface like underground streams converging toward an inevitable flood. Her father's investigation, his carefully gathered evidence, his final desperate gambit to expose the corruption that had poisoned his town, it all came down to what she chose to do next. The key in her purse felt like it weighed 10 pounds, but it also felt like the most important thing she'd ever carried. Evidence that could burn the system to the ground her father had written. Evidence that could finally let the dead rest easy and the living breathe free. Behind her, through the diner's window, she could see Sheriff Thorne still sitting in the booth, his face a mask of calm calculation. But his hands, she noticed with satisfaction, were no longer steady as he reached for his coffee cup. The hunter was beginning to understand that he'd become the hunted, and in Blackwood Creek, that changed everything. The ravens had begun to gather again, lining the power lines like notes in a song of coming judgment. 7 for murder, as Ezra Blackthorne had said. But sometimes, Katrina thought, 7 was also the number of witnesses it took to ensure justice. Chapter 4. A Reluctant Ally. 30 years earlier, the Vance homestead. "Promise me something, Arthur," Thomas Blackwood said, cradling his newborn son while rain drummed against the windows of the Vance study. "If something happens to me, if the weight of this town's secrets finally crushes what's left of my soul, promise me you'll look after the boy." Arthur Vance, himself holding his 6-month-old daughter, had nodded solemnly. The two men sat in the same chairs their children would occupy decades later, but then they'd been united by friendship and shared idealism, not divided by the corruption that would eventually claim Thomas's life and Arthur's crusade for justice. "He's going to need guidance," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with prescience. "This town, it has a way of turning good men into something else. I felt it pulling at me, Arthur. The easy money, the simple solutions, the path that leads away from everything we swore to protect." Arthur had reached across the space between their chairs, gripping his friend's shoulder. "We'll fight it together, Tom. Both our children will grow up in a better Blackwood Creek." Neither man could have foreseen how terribly wrong they'd be, or how their children would inherit not just their names, but their war. Present day, the old mill district, the storm that had been threatening all day, finally broke as Katrina and Ryder took shelter in an abandoned foreman's office deep within the skeletal remains of the Blackwood Creek lumber mill. What had begun as a planned meeting to examine the evidence from Arthur's safe deposit box had become an impromptu refuge when Thorne's patrol cars had begun systematically sweeping the town's perimeter. "They're boxing us in," Ryder observed, peering through a gap in the rusted corrugated siding. Lightning illuminated his profile in stark relief, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the way his dark eyes tracked movement in the distance. 4 cars, maybe 5, coordinated sweep pattern. Professional. Katrina sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, the contents of her father's safe deposit box spread before her like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that depicted a nightmare. Financial records, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, 20 years of meticulous documentation that painted Sheriff Thorne not as a corrupt local official, but as a key operative in an organization that spanned multiple states. "Listen to this," she said, pressing play on a small digital recorder. Her father's voice filled the cramped space, clear and determined despite the obvious stress beneath his words. Day 847 of documentation. "Meeting with the courier confirmed my worst suspicions. The Blackwood Creek pipeline isn't just local corruption, it's a critical link in something much larger. Weapons from the south, drugs from the north, money washing through our banks like poison in the creek. And at the center of it all, Sheriff Thorne, dancing to music composed by someone I've never seen, but whose influence I feel in every compromised vote, every convenient accident, every good person who suddenly decides to stop asking questions. Arthur's recorded voice paused, and they could hear him moving papers, perhaps consulting notes. Thomas Blackwood tried to warn me 20 years ago, said there were forces in this town older than the law, deeper than democracy. I thought he was being dramatic. I thought he was letting despair cloud his judgment. God help me, I was wrong about everything. Ryder's head snapped toward the recorder, his entire body going rigid. Thomas Blackwood, my father mentioned your father? Katrina nodded, her throat tight with emotion she hadn't expected. They were friends, apparently. Partners, even. According to these notes, they were investigating the same corruption 30 years ago before. She gestured helplessly at the evidence surrounding them. Before it consumed your father and killed mine. My father didn't die of a heart attack, Ryder said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of revelation that made the air in the small room feel heavier. He was murdered. Slowly, subtly, but murdered all the same. They destroyed his reputation first, made him look like just another drunk biker who'd lost control of his club. Then they isolated him, turned some of the crows against him, made him question his own judgment. By the time they were finished, he barely resembled the man who'd founded the club to protect this community. Thunder crashed overhead, and in its echo, Katrina heard something that might have been the sound of destiny clicking into place. Two children, shaped by their father's failures and dreams, brought together by the same forces that had destroyed the previous generation. "What did he tell you about my father?" she asked, leaning forward into the small circle of light cast by Ryder's battery-powered lantern. That Arthur Vance was the only honest lawyer in 100 miles, and that made him the most dangerous man in Blackwood Creek. Ryder's smile was grim. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should find your father and tell him everything I knew about Thorne's operation. But by the time I worked up the courage to break the silence, Arthur was already dead too. Katrina felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition, perhaps, or a settling of pieces that had been out of alignment her entire life. "You were going to be a teacher," she said suddenly, the words coming from some deep intuitive understanding. "Before all this. Before your father died and you had to take over the club." Ryder's surprise was genuine, visible even in the dim light. "How did you?" "The way you explain things, the patience you show with information that should be obvious, the books." She gestured toward a small stack of paperbacks he'd placed beside his jacket, literary fiction, not motorcycle magazines. "You have teacher hands." Careful, precise, used to showing rather than just telling. For a moment, the hardened biker leader disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who looked younger and infinitely more vulnerable. "English literature," he admitted. "Had a scholarship to state, planned to come back and teach at the high school. Wanted to show kids there were worlds beyond Blackwood Creek's limitations, stories bigger than the ones they'd been told about themselves." "What happened?" "My father died, and the club started falling apart without leadership. Half the members wanted to go legitimate, run security for local businesses, maybe start a motorcycle repair shop. The other half wanted to go full criminal, partner with whoever offered the most money." Ryder ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture revealing exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. "I was 22, had no idea how to hold 30 grown men together, but I knew what would happen if I didn't try." Thorne was already circling like a vulture, offering protection and opportunities. "I couldn't let him turn the crows into his personal army, so you sacrificed your dreams to save theirs." "I tried to, but it turned out saving them meant damning us all." His laugh was bitter. "Thorne waited until I'd consolidated control, until the men trusted me completely. Then he showed me a file full of evidence, real crimes, some we'd committed before I took over, others manufactured after. Weapons charges, drug trafficking, assault, even murder. All documented, all prosecutable, all guaranteed to destroy the lives of men who'd followed me because they believed I could protect them." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like fingers tapping out an urgent message. Katrina found herself studying Ryder's face in the lantern light, seeing not the dangerous outlaw she'd initially perceived, but a man trapped between impossible choices, doing his best to minimize harm in a system designed to corrupt everyone it touched. "He owns us," Ryder continued, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Every job we do for him, every shipment we move, every time we intimidate someone asking inconvenient questions, it's all documented, filed away, added to the leverage he holds over our heads. We're not criminals by choice anymore. We're criminals by necessity, and that makes us more useful to him than any hired thugs could be." "There has to be a way out," Katrina said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized how naive they sounded. "Legal immunity, witness protection, something. For 30 men with families and criminal records in a town where Thorne controls the courts," Ryder shook his head. "The system you're thinking of, the one with rules and safeguards and constitutional protections, that system doesn't exist in Blackwood Creek. Here, there's only power and fear, and the constant calculation of who has more of which." A new sound cut through the storm, the distant growl of motorcycle engines, multiple bikes moving in formation. Ryder was on his feet instantly, his entire demeanor shifting from vulnerability to predatory alertness. "That's Jack's," he said, recognizing something in the engine note that Katrina couldn't distinguish. 3 bikes coming fast. Either they found a way through Thorne's cordon, or— he didn't finish the sentence, but his hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. The bikes grew louder, closer, then suddenly went silent. Footsteps approached through the rain, careful but urgent. A sharp whistle, 3 short notes echoed through the storm, and Ryder relaxed slightly. "All clear signal," he explained, moving toward the office's single door. But they wouldn't risk coming here unless something was wrong. Jax appeared in the doorway moments later, water streaming from his leather jacket, his scarred face grim with news that was clearly not good. Behind him, 2 other crows, men Katrina recognized from the funeral but couldn't name, flanked the entrance like sentries. "We've got problems," Jax announced without preamble. "Big ones. Thorne's not just looking for you too, he's moving against the club directly. Arrested Danny and Marcus an hour ago on weapons charges. Seized their bikes, their houses, everything. Word is he's planning to roll up the entire organization, pin everything that's ever gone wrong in this town on us." Ryder's face went completely still, the kind of absolute calm that preceded either surrender or violence. "He's cutting loose ends. Gets worse," Jax continued. "He's brought in outside help. State police, maybe federal. Saw at least 20 unmarked cars moving through town, all heading toward the roost. They're not planning arrests, Ryder. They're planning a massacre, then they'll call it a raid gone wrong." Katrina felt the world tilt around her as the implications crashed home. Thorne wasn't just trying to silence her and intimidate Ryder. He was preparing to eliminate the crows entirely, probably with her and Ryder labeled as casualties of a violent confrontation with dangerous criminals. "How long do we have?" Ryder asked, his voice steady despite the catastrophe unfolding around them. "Maybe 2 hours before they make their move. But here's the thing," Jax glanced at Katrina, then back to his leader. "Some of the boys are talking about running, taking their families and disappearing before Thorne can spring his trap. Can't say I blame them, but if they scatter, the evidence disappears with them," Katrina finished, understanding immediately. "Their testimony, their knowledge of Thorne's operations, everything we'd need to build a federal case." "Exactly. And without the club to back us up, we're just 2 people with a box full of accusations against a sheriff who's about to be hailed as a hero for cleaning up the biggest criminal organization in the county's history." The 3 of them stood in the circle of lantern light, rain drumming overhead, while the weight of impossible choices settled around them like gravity. Outside, Blackwood Creek slept on, unaware that its fate was being decided in an abandoned mill office by a lawyer who'd wanted nothing more than to settle her father's estate, and a biker who'd dreamed of teaching children to love literature. "There's another option," Katrina said slowly, her legal mind beginning to work through possibilities that conventional wisdom would reject as insane. "We don't wait for Thorne to come to us. We take the fight to him, but we do it publicly, in a way that makes it impossible for him to control the narrative." "What are you thinking?" Ryder asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected her answer wouldn't be entirely sane. The annual town council meeting is tomorrow night. Required by state law, open to the public, recorded for the official record. If we could get this evidence presented there, in front of witnesses who can't be intimidated or bought. They'd kill us before we got through the courthouse door, Jax objected, but his tone carried more consideration than dismissal. Maybe, Katrina agreed. Or maybe they'd be so focused on the crows that they wouldn't expect a direct legal challenge. Especially if the crows provided a very visible distraction elsewhere in town. Ryder studied her face in the lantern light, and she could almost see him evaluating her proposal from every angle, calculating risks against potential rewards. You're talking about splitting our forces, dividing our attention, fighting a war on multiple fronts against an enemy who knows the terrain better than we do. I'm talking about using their expectations against them, Katrina corrected. Thorne thinks like a criminal, all force and intimidation. He's not prepared for someone who thinks like a lawyer. And if you're wrong, if he's smarter than you think, better prepared than we've assumed? Katrina looked down at her father's evidence, at 20 years of careful documentation that represented his life's work and his death sentence. Then we'll go down fighting for something that matters, instead of hiding in abandoned buildings while evil men rewrite history. The storm began to ease outside, but inside the small office, 3 unlikely allies prepared to wage a war that would either save Blackwood Creek or destroy what remained of their own lives. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like the sound of approaching judgment, and the ravens, always the ravens, settled into the trees to wait and watch and bear witness to whatever came next. As Ryder reached for his radio to contact the scattered crows, as Jax began mentally cataloging weapons and escape routes, as Katrina started planning the most important legal presentation of her career, none of them noticed the small, silent figure moving through the shadows beyond the mill complex. Someone was watching. Someone was listening. And someone was already making plans to ensure that Sheriff Gideon Thorne learned exactly what his enemies intended to do, and when they intended to do it. The weight of inheritance, Katrina was beginning to understand, wasn't just about what you received from those who came before. Sometimes, it was about what you chose to leave for those who came after. And in Blackwood Creek, that choice was about to be made with bullets and blood and the desperate hope that truth, once spoken aloud, could never again be completely silenced. Chapter 5. Unearthing the Truth. GPS coordinates. 44. 2,619 degrees N, 72. 5,806 degrees W. Whisperwind Ridge. Arthur's hidden archive. The coordinates had been hidden in the metadata of a seemingly innocuous photograph Arthur had kept in his safe deposit box. A family portrait from Katrina's 8th birthday, digitally enhanced to conceal navigation data that would lead to his final insurance policy. It had taken Katrina 3 hours of forensic analysis, with software she'd used in corporate espionage cases to crack her father's digital cipher, but the discovery had been worth the effort. Your old man was more paranoid than I gave him credit for, Ryder observed as they made their way up the narrow deer trail that wound toward the ridge. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but they needed the cover of darkness to reach Arthur's hidden archive without being detected by Thorne's increasingly aggressive patrols. He was thorough, Katrina corrected, adjusting the straps of the tactical backpack Jax had provided. The pack contained everything they might need for extended surveillance: night vision equipment, encrypted communications gear, and enough provisions to last several days if Thorne managed to pin them down in the mountains. He learned early that in Blackwood Creek, being right wasn't enough. You had to be right and prepared for everyone else to try to kill you for it. Behind them, the lights of the town twinkled like fallen stars, deceptively peaceful in the pre-dawn gloom. But Katrina knew that apparent serenity was an illusion. Even now, Thorne's deputies were positioning themselves for the morning raid that would either end the Crows as an organization or cement them as scapegoats for 20 years of systematic corruption. "Movement," Ryder said quietly, his hand finding her elbow to halt their progress. 200 yards down the trail. Multiple contacts. Katrina followed his gaze through the night vision scope he'd handed her, her blood chilling as she made out the distinctive silhouettes of armed men moving in tactical formation up the mountainside. 6 figures, maybe 7, all carrying military-grade equipment that definitely didn't belong to the Blackwood Creek Sheriff's Department. "Federal," she whispered, though she already suspected the answer would be more complicated. "Wrong gear, wrong formation," Ryder replied, his voice tight with recognition. "Private contractors, the kind Vane uses when he wants problems solved permanently and quietly." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Somehow, despite all their precautions, all their careful planning, Thorne had anticipated their move. Either he'd broken the digital encryption faster than seemed possible, or someone told him, she breathed, the betrayal cutting deeper than the physical danger. Someone knew where we were going. Ryder's face went hard in the green-tinted light of the night vision scope. Jax knew the coordinates, so did Tommy and Marcus, but their family, Katrina, they'd die before they'd betray the club. Then how? The crack of a high-powered rifle cut through the mountain air, the bullet striking a tree trunk inches from Katrina's head and sending splinters of bark across her face. The contractors below had spotted them, and whatever element of surprise they'd hoped to maintain was now gone. "Move!" Ryder shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her off the main trail into the dense undergrowth that cloaked the ridge's northern face. "Stay low, stay quiet, and follow my lead." The next 15 minutes blurred into a nightmare of scrambling through thorny brush, sliding down muddy slopes, and trying to breathe quietly while armed men crashed through the forest behind them like hunting hounds following a scent. Ryder moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his childhood exploring these mountains, but Katrina's city-softened conditioning left her gasping and stumbling as they climbed toward the ridge's summit. "Can't keep this pace," she managed between ragged breaths, her lungs burning from the altitude and exertion. "Almost there," Ryder promised, though his own breathing was labored. "Your father chose his location well. There's only one approach to the archive, and it's designed to be defensible." A fresh volley of gunfire erupted behind them, closer now, and Katrina heard the distinctive whistle of bullets passing overhead. The contractors were gaining ground, their superior equipment and training beginning to tell against her exhaustion and Ryder's protective instincts. Then they crested a small rise, and Katrina saw it. A structure that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside itself, so perfectly camouflaged that it was almost invisible even from 20 feet away. Arthur's final refuge wasn't the rustic hunting cabin she'd expected, but something far more sophisticated. A bunker disguised as a natural rock formation, with solar panels hidden among the trees and communication equipment that looked military in origin. "Jesus!" Ryder breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. How long was he planning for this? The bunker's entrance was secured by a biometric scanner that accepted Katrina's handprint. Arthur had apparently anticipated that she might need access to his final sanctuary. Inside, the space was cramped but efficiently organized, with multiple computer workstations, wall-mounted displays showing surveillance feeds from around Blackwood Creek, and filing cabinets that contained physical backups of every piece of evidence Arthur had gathered over 2 decades. But it was the central display that made Katrina's breath catch in her throat. A detailed organizational chart filled the screen, mapping the entire criminal network that controlled Blackwood Creek and its surrounding region. Sheriff Thorne occupied a prominent position, but he was clearly a middle management figure in a hierarchy that stretched from local street dealers all the way up to corporate boardrooms in major cities. At the top of the pyramid, surrounded by question marks and tentative connections, was a name she'd heard only in whispers: Silas Vane. "Your father wasn't just investigating local corruption," Ryder said, studying the chart with growing understanding. "He was mapping an entire shadow government." Katrina nodded, her finger tracing the connections between various nodes on the network. "Look at this. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering, human trafficking. It's not just crime, it's infrastructure." They're running a parallel economy that touches every legitimate business in the valley. And the Crows? She found their entry on the chart, connected to Thorne by thick red lines that were labeled COERCED-ASSETS blackmail leverage. But there were other connections too, dotted lines that suggested Arthur had suspected the club's potential as allies rather than enemies. He knew, she said softly, understanding flooding through her. He knew you were victims, not collaborators. That's why he never tried to expose the club directly. He was waiting for the right moment to turn you against Thorne. Before Ryder could respond, alarms began blaring from the surveillance system. The display screens flickered to life, showing multiple camera angles of the bunker's perimeter. The contractors had found them, and they were setting up for what looked like a professional siege operation. "How many?" Ryder asked, moving to a weapons locker that Arthur had apparently stocked for exactly this kind of emergency. 12, maybe 15, Katrina replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Professional-grade equipment, coordinated assault pattern. They're not planning to take prisoners." Ryder handed her a pistol, checking his own weapon with practiced efficiency. "Your father built this place to withstand a siege, but it's not going to hold forever. We need an exit strategy." "There," Katrina said, pointing to a section of the organizational chart that showed escape routes and safe houses throughout the region. "He's got contingency plans mapped out. Multiple extraction points, backup communication protocols, even offshore accounts for emergency funding. Smart man, but first we need to get out of here alive." The sound of cutting tools echoed from the bunker's entrance as the contractors began working to breach Arthur's security measures. They had maybe 10 minutes before the tactical team forced entry, and once that happened, the cramped confines of the bunker would become a death trap. "Katrina," Ryder said, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before, "if we don't make it out of here." "We will," she interrupted, but he caught her hand, his dark eyes intense in the bunker's LED lighting. "If we don't," he continued, "I want you to know that meeting you, fighting alongside you. It's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose. A reason to believe that good can actually triumph over evil, even in a place like Blackwood Creek." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding and shared danger. Then the first explosion rocked the bunker's outer defenses, and survival instincts kicked in with brutal clarity. "Arthur's emergency protocol," Katrina said, her fingers flying over the computer keyboard. "He's got a dead man's switch built into the system. If the bunker is compromised, it automatically uploads everything to federal servers and triggers alerts to every major news organization in the country. Do it." She initiated the protocol, watching as 20 years of evidence began streaming across encrypted channels to destinations her father had chosen long before his death. Within hours, Arthur Vance's final case would be in the hands of federal prosecutors, investigative journalists, and oversight agencies that even Sela's vein couldn't buy or intimidate. But first, they had to live long enough to see justice served. The bunker's hidden exit opened into a natural cave system that Arthur had apparently explored and mapped years earlier. As they crawled through narrow passages that led deep into the mountain's heart, Katrina could hear the contractors breaking through the outer defenses behind them, could imagine their frustration when they discovered that their targets had vanished into the mountain itself. "This way," Ryder said, consulting a map Arthur had left in the escape tunnel. "There's an old mining entrance about half a mile down the ridge. If we can reach it before they realize we're gone." They emerged from the caves into the pre-dawn light, the valley spreading below them like a vast map of corruption and complicity. But something had changed during their hours underground. The lights of Blackwood Creek were different now: emergency vehicles, news vans, and what looked like a convoy of federal agents were converging on the town from multiple directions. "Your father's evidence," Ryder said with grim satisfaction. "It's already working." Katrina's phone buzzed with incoming messages, reporters requesting interviews, federal agents seeking to arrange protected witness testimony, and a text from Judge Whitmore that simply read, "Well done, counselor. Arthur would be proud." But it was the final message that made her smile despite their desperate circumstances. From Jax, sent through encrypted channels, "The cavalry's coming. Thorne's in federal custody. The Crows are free. As they made their way down the mountainside toward a Blackwood Creek that was finally, genuinely free, Katrina realized that her father's greatest victory hadn't been the evidence he'd gathered or the criminals he'd exposed. It had been the network of allies he'd cultivated, the relationships he'd built, the trust he'd earned from people like Ryder Blackwood who'd learned to believe in justice again. The truth, once unearthed, had proven to be every bit as powerful as Arthur Vance had believed it would be. And in the growing light of dawn, that truth was finally setting Blackwood Creek free. Behind them, in the abandoned bunker, contractors found only empty computers and a note Arthur had left for anyone who might breach his final sanctuary. To whoever finds this, the truth always surfaces, no matter how deep you try to bury it. The only question is whether you'll be standing in the light when it does, or drowning in the darkness you've created. Choose wisely. The ravens had fallen silent at last. Their vigil was over. The dead could finally rest, and the living could finally breathe free. Chapter 6. The Festival of Lies. 150 years ago, the first Founders' Day festival had been a genuine celebration. A harvest feast shared by the original settlers of Blackwood Creek, men and women who'd carved a community from the wilderness through shared labor and mutual trust. They'd gathered around bonfires to tell stories, share food, and commemorate the day they'd signed the charter that established their town as a place where justice and prosperity would flourish hand in hand. Now, Sheriff Gideon Thorne stood on the same ground where those idealistic pioneers had made their promises, watching modern-day Blackwood Creek prepare for what he privately called the annual masquerade. The festival had evolved into something those original settlers would never recognize, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to convince outsiders that their town was thriving, while ensuring locals understood exactly who controlled their prosperity. Every vendor booth was licensed through shell companies he controlled. Every security contractor was on his payroll. Even the traditional Pioneer's Blessing ceremony, where the mayor read from the original town charter, had been modified over the decades to emphasize loyalty, order, and the importance of trusting established authority. "Beautiful evening for the festival, Sheriff," Mayor Patricia Hendricks said as she approached his position near the main stage. She was a nervous woman in her 50s, elected primarily because she asked no difficult questions and signed whatever documents were placed before her. The weather held perfectly. Thorne nodded, his eyes scanning the growing crowd for signs of the trouble he knew was coming. Katrina Vance and Ryder Blackwood were somewhere in this throng of families and tourists, carrying evidence that could unravel everything he'd spent 25 years building. His contractors had failed to eliminate them at the mountain bunker, and federal agents were already asking inconvenient questions about the firefight that had left 3 mercenaries dead and Arthur's archive completely empty. "Mayor," he replied, his voice carrying its usual warm authority despite the cold calculation behind his eyes. "I trust you're prepared for tonight's ceremony. The reading of the charter is particularly important this year." She nodded eagerly, not understanding the subtext but recognizing the warning in his tone. "Of course, Sheriff, just as we discussed. Emphasis on community stability, respect for law enforcement, the dangers of outside agitation." "Exactly. Our citizens need to be reminded that change, especially rapid, imposed change, can be very dangerous for a community like ours." What Mayor Hendricks didn't know was that Thorne had rewritten significant portions of the charter reading, transforming the pioneers' call for justice and self-determination into a script that would psychologically prepare the townspeople for what was about to unfold. By the time the evening was over, Blackwood Creek would understand that questioning authority led to chaos, that reformers were really destroyers, and that their sheriff was all that stood between them and total anarchy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Allow Katrina and Ryder to make their grand gesture, then respond with overwhelming force that would paint them as dangerous radicals who'd threatened innocent families. The festival would provide perfect cover, children present to heighten the emotional stakes, media coverage to ensure the narrative reached beyond Blackwood Creek, and hundreds of witnesses who would remember only the sheriff's heroic response to violent extremists. "Sheriff Thorne?" A young voice interrupted his planning. He turned to see 8-year-old Emma Chen, dressed in a miniature pioneer costume for the children's pageant, looking up at him with the kind of absolute trust that made his remaining conscience writhe uncomfortably. "Hello, Emma. Are you excited about the pageant?" "Yes, sir. Mama says you keep us all safe so we can have fun times like this." Her smile was radiant, completely innocent of the darkness that surrounded her daily life. Thorne felt the familiar burn of acid in his stomach, the physical manifestation of choices made and souls sold. Emma's family ran the town's only independent restaurant, one of the few businesses that hadn't been absorbed into his network of controlled enterprises. They paid their protection money quietly, asked no questions, and trusted that their compliance would keep their daughter safe. "That's right, sweetheart," he managed, his voice only slightly strained. "You just focus on having fun tonight, okay? And stay close to your parents." As Emma skipped away toward the children's staging area, Thorne caught sight of a familiar figure moving through the crowd with predatory intent. Marcus, the courier, Webb Seela's Vane's personal representative, and the man who'd handed Arthur Vance his death sentence on that bridge weeks ago. Webb's presence could mean only one thing: Vane was taking direct control of the situation. Thorne intercepted him near the dart-throwing booth, where the carnival noise would mask their conversation. Webb was a thin, sharp-featured man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as an outsider despite his careful attempts to blend in. "You're early," Thorne said without preamble. "The situation isn't resolved yet." "That's exactly why I'm here," Webb replied, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone who spoke for power that dwarfed local concerns. "Mr. Vane is disappointed by recent developments. A federal task force was assembled this morning. They're asking questions about connections between local law enforcement and certain business interests." The words hit Thorne like physical blows. Federal involvement meant the end of the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for decades. Once federal investigators started following money trails and examining communication records, even his most carefully constructed defenses would crumble. "The Vance evidence," he said, though it wasn't really a question, "is more comprehensive than we anticipated," Webb confirmed. "But it's not yet in federal hands. Our sources indicate it's still in local custody, which means we have a narrow window to contain the damage." "How narrow?" "Tonight. After that, too many people will know too much, and even Mr. Vane's influence has limitations when federal prosecutors become involved." Thorne understood. The festival wasn't just cover for his original plan anymore. It was his last chance to eliminate the threat before it spread beyond his ability to control. And if that meant turning a community celebration into a battlefield, with children and families caught in the crossfire, he pushed the thought away. 25 years ago, he'd chosen this path by pulling the trigger on a federal agent. Every decision since then had been about survival, about maintaining the balance of power that kept him alive and in control. Tonight would simply be the logical conclusion of choices made long ago. "What do you need from me?" he asked. The festival grounds evening Katrina moved through the festival crowd with the hyper-awareness of someone who understood that every smile might mask a potential enemy, every friendly conversation might be cover for surveillance. She'd changed her appearance as much as possible, dyeing her hair auburn, wearing glasses she didn't need, dressing like a local in jeans and a festival t-shirt. But she knew disguises would only buy her limited time in a community this small. The festival itself was surreally normal, filled with the kind of innocent Americana she'd grown up taking for granted. Children shrieked with delight on carnival rides, teenagers flirted awkwardly near the funnel cake stand, elderly couples slow danced to classic country songs performed by the local high school band. If she hadn't known better, she might have found it charming. But she did know better. The evidence from Arthur's bunker, now safely copied to multiple secure locations, but not yet released, painted a picture of a community whose wholesome surface concealed decades of systematic exploitation. The festival itself was funded by money laundered through Thorne's network. The vendor permits were distributed according to loyalty rather than merit, and even the children's pageant had been designed to reinforce messages about respecting authority and fearing change. "Any sign of our target?" Jax's voice crackled softly through the tiny earpiece she wore, invisible beneath her dyed hair. "Not yet," she replied, pretending to laugh at something the face-painting booth volunteer had said. "But he's here somewhere. This is too important for him to delegate." The plan was simpler than their previous operations, but far more dangerous. While Ryder and the loyal crows created visible distractions at key points around the festival, Katrina would approach the main stage during the mayor's traditional reading of the town charter. Using a hijacked sound system, courtesy of Tommy Chen's expertise with electronics, she would broadcast Arthur's evidence directly to the festival crowd, ensuring that hundreds of witnesses heard the truth about Sheriff Thorne's criminal enterprise. It was theatrical, risky, and almost certainly suicidal. But it was also the kind of public confrontation that would be impossible to cover up or dismiss, especially with news crews already present to document the festival for feel-good human interest stories. "Katrina," Ryder's voice came through a different channel, calm but urgent. "I've got eyes on Thorne. He's talking to someone I don't recognize. Expensive suit, federal bearing. This might be the cavalry we've been waiting for." She turned casually, following Ryder's subtle directional cues until she spotted Thorne near the dart booth. The man with him was definitely not local. His posture, his clothing, even the way he held his head marked him as someone accustomed to wielding serious power. But something about their body language suggested alliance rather than confrontation. "That's not a federal agent," she realized, her blood chilling. "That's someone from up the chain. Vane's people are here." The implications crashed over her like ice water. If Silas Vane had sent personal representatives to Blackwood Creek, it meant the stakes had escalated beyond local corruption into something that threatened the entire network. And that meant the festival, with its hundreds of innocent attendees, was about to become a war zone. "Abort?" Jax asked, picking up on her changed tone. Katrina looked around at the families enjoying what might be their last peaceful evening in Blackwood Creek, at children like Emma Chen who deserved to grow up in a town where justice was more than a word painted on courthouse walls. Her father had died trying to give them that chance. She wouldn't dishonor his sacrifice by walking away now. "Negative," she said firmly. "We stick to the plan, but everyone stays alert. Things are about to get much more dangerous." As if summoned by her words, the festival's cheerful atmosphere began to shift in subtle ways. She noticed more security personnel than usual, men in suits who stood too stiffly, scanned crowds too systematically, spoke into hidden microphones with practiced efficiency. Parents started unconsciously gathering their children closer, responding to signals they might not even consciously perceive, but which their instincts recognized as harbingers of trouble. The high school band finished their set and began clearing the main stage for Mayor Hendrick's traditional address. In the growing twilight, strings of festival lights created pools of warmth and shadow that could hide anything. The perfect setting for confrontation, Katrina realized. The perfect place for truth and lies to finally meet in open combat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Hendrick's amplified voice crackled across the festival grounds, "if I could have your attention, please. It's time for our traditional reading of the Founders' Charter, the document that established our wonderful community and the values that guide us still today." Katrina began moving toward the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs but her resolve steady as stone. Around her, families gathered close to hear words that had been corrupted into instruments of oppression, unaware that they were about to witness either the rebirth of their community's ideals or the violent death of anyone brave enough to speak truth to power. In the shadows beyond the stage lights, she caught a glimpse of Ryder positioning himself near the sound booth, his dark eyes meeting hers across the crowd with an intensity that spoke of shared understanding and absolute commitment. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The mayor began to read, her voice carrying across the hushed festival grounds. "We, the founders of Blackwood Creek, do solemnly swear to establish a community based on justice, prosperity, and the sacred trust between neighbors." But the words that followed were not the ones the pioneers had written. They had been carefully altered, transformed from a declaration of independence into a subtle manifesto of submission. And in that perversion of their ancestors' dreams, Katrina found her final motivation. It was time to remind Blackwood Creek what their founders had actually promised. Time to honor the oath those long-dead pioneers had sworn. Time to make sure that truth, once spoken, could never again be silenced by those who profited from darkness. The Festival of Lies was about to become a reckoning with truth. And in the growing darkness, with children's laughter echoing across grounds that had been bought with blood money, Katrina Vance prepared to light the match that would burn the whole rotten system to the ground. The ravens had returned to their perches in the surrounding trees, dozens of them, watching with intelligent eyes as history prepared to pivot on the choices of the desperate and the brave. 7 cause for murder, as old Ezra Blackthorne had said. But sometimes, Katrina thought, 7 was also the number of witnesses it took to ensure justice. And tonight, there would be far more than 7. Chapter 7, The Betrayal. 2 hours before the festival Marcus, Slick, Rodriguez sat in his rusted pickup truck outside Mercy General Hospital, his calloused hands trembling as he held the photograph that had destroyed his world. The image showed his 8-year-old daughter Sophia in her hospital bed, tubes snaking from her small body to machines that kept her alive while doctors searched desperately for a compatible bone marrow donor. She'd been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months ago, just days after Slick had refused Sheriff Thorne's recruitment offer to become an informant within the Crows. The timing, Slick now understood, had not been coincidental. The cancer was real, the doctors had confirmed that much, but the sudden suspension of Sophia's health insurance, the mysterious delays in treatment authorization, the convenient unavailability of specialists who might have caught the disease earlier, those were Thorne's handiwork. "Beautiful little girl," Marcus Webb had said when he'd approached Slick in the hospital parking garage the week before. "Terrible thing, childhood leukemia. Though I understand there's been a promising development, a potential donor match in Seattle. Expensive procedure, of course, $150,000 minimum, plus the ongoing treatment costs, the rehabilitation, the years of follow-up care." Slick had wanted to kill the man right there, had felt his hands instinctively reaching for the knife he carried in his boot. But Webb had simply smiled and continued speaking with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. "Fortunately, there are people in this community who believe in helping families during medical crises. Sheriff Thorne's discretionary fund, for instance, has been known to cover exceptional expenses for worthy causes. All it requires is a demonstration of community spirit. A willingness to contribute to public safety efforts." The envelope Webb had handed him contained not just photographs of Sophia, but detailed medical records showing how her condition would deteriorate without immediate intervention. There were also financial projections showing the cost of treatment, insurance documents outlining coverage limitations, and a single sheet of hospital letterhead bearing the signature of Dr. Patricia Miles, the pediatric oncologist who becomes Sophia's last hope. "Mr. Rodriguez's time is critical. The donor match in Seattle will only hold the reservation for 72 hours. Without immediate financial guarantee, we will be forced to move to the next candidate on the list. I'm sorry." Dr. Miles, the date on the letter was today. The deadline was midnight. "What do you want from me?" Slick had asked, though he'd already known the answer would cost him his soul. "Just information," Webb had replied. "Meeting locations, timing, strategic objectives. Nothing that would directly endanger Mr. Blackwood or his inner circle. Simply enough advance warning to ensure public safety during any demonstrations they might be planning." It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Slick realized now as he sat in the hospital parking lot watching families come and go through the emergency entrance. Webb hadn't asked him to betray his brothers directly, just to provide public safety information that would help law enforcement prepare for potential disturbances. The kind of cooperation any responsible citizen might provide, especially one whose child's life hung in the balance. But Slick knew better. He'd grown up in Blackwood Creek, had watched Sheriff Thorne's definition of public safety evolve over the decades into something that served power rather than people. Whatever information he provided would be used not to protect innocents, but to destroy the only family he'd ever known besides Sophia. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Donor prep starting in Seattle. Need financial confirmation within 2 hours. Dr. Miles, 2 hours. 2 hours to choose between his daughter's life and his brother's freedom. 2 hours to decide whether he was a father first or a crow first, knowing that choosing either would destroy everything he valued about himself. He started the truck and drove toward the festival grounds, where Ryder and the others would be making their final preparations for the operation that would either free Blackwood Creek or get them all killed. They trusted him completely, these men who'd become his family when his own blood relatives had given up on the kid from the wrong side of the tracks. They'd never question his presence, never suspect that desperation had finally found a price he couldn't afford to refuse. As he drove, Slick's phone rang, Dr. Miles' number. Mr. Rodriguez, I wanted to call personally. Sophia's been asking for you. She's scared about the procedure, but she's trying to be brave. She keeps saying her daddy taught her that crows never give up, never abandon family. The doctor's voice was gentle, professional, but Slick caught the underlying urgency. The surgical team in Seattle is standing by, but time really is critical. Without the donor transfer in the next few hours, Slick closed his eyes, feeling tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months burning behind his lids. Sophia, barely 8 years old, fighting a battle that would have broken grown men, drawing strength from the values he'd tried to teach her about loyalty and family and never giving up. Values he was about to betray to save her life. Tell her daddy loves her, he managed. Tell her daddy's going to make sure she gets better. When he arrived at the festival grounds, he found the crows gathered near their bikes in the darkened parking area behind the maintenance sheds. Ryder was briefing the team on final operational details, his voice calm and confident despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Tommy, you're sure about the sound system hack? Ryder asked, his dark eyes intense in the glow of the security lighting. Tommy Chen nodded, his electronics expertise making him invaluable for technical operations. Piece of cake. The festival uses a centralized PA system with wireless capability. I can override it from anywhere within 200 yards, pipe in whatever audio feed Katrina needs. Jack's security positions? Thorne's got more muscle than usual tonight, Jax replied, consulting notes on his phone. Maybe 20 deputies, plus some guys I don't recognize, professional types. They're positioned around the perimeter, trying to look casual, but they're watching everything. Slick listened to the familiar rhythm of operational planning, the brotherhood of men who'd learned to trust each other's lives to collective competence and shared commitment. In 12 years with the Crows, he'd never doubted that these men would die for him if necessary. Now he was about to repay that loyalty with information that would get them arrested, beaten, or worse. What about escape routes? Ryder continued. Once Katrina makes her broadcast, they're going to come at us with everything they have. 3 primary routes, Ghost replied, the club's most experienced rider and their expert on evasion tactics. North through the industrial district, south toward the county line, or east up into the mountains. I've got bikes positioned at all 3 points, full tanks, emergency supplies. Good. Remember, the objective isn't to fight our way out. It's to make sure Katrina's message gets heard by as many people as possible before they shut us down. Everything else is secondary to that mission. Slick felt his phone vibrate with another text message, but he didn't need to check it to know what it said. Time running out. Decision required. Choose your daughter or choose your brothers, but choose now. Slick! Ryder's voice cut through his internal torment. You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay? For a moment, Slick considered telling them everything. The diagnosis, the blackmail, the impossible choice he'd been forced to make. These men had been his family longer than anyone except Sophia. They'd understand, maybe even find a way to help that didn't involve betraying everything they'd fought for. But then he thought about Sophia's voice on the phone that morning, weak but determined. Daddy, I'm not scared of the surgery. Crows are brave, right? We don't give up. Just thinking about what comes next, he said instead. After tonight, everything changes. Win or lose, the club will never be the same. Ryder nodded soberly. That's the price of freedom, but it's a price worth paying, especially for the kids who will grow up in whatever Blackwood Creek becomes after we expose the truth. Kids like Sophia, Slick thought. Kids who deserve to grow up in a world where power couldn't casually destroy families who refused to cooperate, where sheriffs served justice instead of criminal empires, where fathers didn't have to choose between their daughter's life and their brother's freedom. But Sophia wouldn't grow up at all if he chose his brothers over the treatment that could save her. "I need to make a call," he said, stepping away from the group. "Personal stuff." "Give me 5 minutes." Ryder waved him away with the casual trust of a leader who'd never had reason to doubt any of his men. That trust felt like a knife twisting in Slick's chest as he walked far enough away to ensure privacy, then dialed the number Marcus Webb had given him. "I was beginning to wonder if you changed your mind," Webb answered on the first ring, his voice carrying smug satisfaction. "The sound system," Slick said without preamble, his voice flat and emotionless. "They're planning to hack the festival PA during the mayor's speech, broadcast some kind of evidence recording to the whole crowd. Timing? During the charter reading, maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock. Escape routes." Slick closed his eyes, feeling each word fall from his lips like a physical weight. "North through Industrial, south toward County Line, east to the mountains. They've got bikes positioned at each route." "Excellent." "And Blackwood himself will be at the sound booth, providing security while the lawyer makes her broadcast." There was silence on the other end of the line, the kind of calculating pause that suggested Webb was already formulating countermeasures. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from smugness to something approaching respect. "You're making the right choice, Rodriguez. Family first, always. The transfer authorization will be in Dr. Miles' hands within the hour, and the surgical team in Seattle has been alerted to begin preparations immediately." The line went dead, leaving Slick standing alone in the darkness beyond the maintenance sheds, listening to his brothers finalize plans he just sold to their enemies. In the distance, festival music drifted across the night air, cheerful, innocent, completely unaware of the violence that was about to be unleashed. He'd saved Sophia's life. That was what mattered. That was what he'd tell himself in the years to come, if he lived long enough to have years to come. His daughter would grow up healthy and strong, would never know that her father's love had been purchased with the betrayal of every principle he'd ever claimed to believe in. But as he walked back toward his brothers, Slick Rodriguez understood that he'd already died in every way that truly mattered. The man who taught Sophia that crows never abandon family was gone, replaced by something smaller and more desperate, a father who'd learned that love could be just as corrupting as greed and infinitely more painful. Behind him, his phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Miles, financial approval received. Sophia is being prepared for transport to Seattle. Surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. You've saved your daughter's life. Ahead, Ryder was calling the team together for their final blessing, a ritual they'd performed before every dangerous operation, a moment of shared commitment to brotherhood and the cause they served. Slick took his place in the circle, accepted the ritual handshake from each man who trusted him completely, and prepared to watch them walk into the trap he'd helped set. In the distance, ravens called from the power lines, 7 harsh cries that cut through the festival music like omens of the violence to come. And in that sound, Slick heard the echo of every choice that had led him to this moment, every compromise that had seemed justified until the moment it destroyed everything he'd tried to protect. 7 cause for murder, as old Ezra Blackthorne had warned. But sometimes murder came in forms more subtle than bullets, more devastating than blood. Sometimes murder was simply a father's love turned into a weapon against everything he'd once held sacred. The Festival of Lies was about to become something far darker, and Marcus Rodriguez, who'd once been called Slick with brotherhood and respect, would spend whatever remained of his life knowing that he'd lit the match that burned down everything he'd ever truly loved. Chapter 8. Running on Empty. 11:47 p.m. Festival grounds. The festival lights still twinkled cheerfully across the grounds, but their warm glow now illuminated a scene from a nightmare. Families scattered in panic as Sheriff Thorne's tactical units moved through the crowd with military precision, their riot gear, and automatic weapons turning a community celebration into a war zone. Children cried for parents who'd been separated in the chaos. Vendors abandoned their booths as tear gas canisters rolled between the rides, and the cheerful carnival music continued playing with grotesque inappropriateness over speakers now controlled by Thorne's people. Katrina pressed herself against the wooden wall of the haunted house attraction, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what had gone so catastrophically wrong. The plan had been perfect. Tommy's hack of the sound system had worked flawlessly, her father's evidence had begun broadcasting to the assembled crowd, and for one shining moment, the truth had rung out across Blackwood Creek like a bell calling the community to justice. Then the lights had cut out. Emergency sirens had begun wailing, and Thorne's tactical teams had emerged from positions they couldn't possibly have reached without advance knowledge of exactly where to wait. They knew, she whispered into her radio headset, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Someone told them exactly what we were planning. Ryder's voice crackled back through static and background noise. Copy that. Jax reports his position was surrounded before he could even start his bike. This wasn't random, Katrina. This was surgical. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the sounds of violence and fear that surrounded her. Somewhere in the maze of carnival attractions and vendor booths, Thorne's people were hunting her and the remaining crows with the focused intensity of professionals who'd been given detailed intelligence about their target's capabilities and weaknesses. A burst of automatic gunfire echoed from the direction of the Ferris wheel, followed by a scream that might have been Jax's voice. Katrina bit down on her lip hard enough to taste blood, fighting the urge to break cover and run toward the sound. Training from her corporate security consultations kicked in. In a tactical situation, emotion got you killed. Analysis kept you alive long enough to matter. North route's compromised, Ghost's voice reported over the radio, his usual calm shattered by whatever he was seeing. They've got the industrial district locked down tight. Military-grade roadblocks, surveillance drones, the whole package. This isn't local law enforcement anymore. South route? Ryder asked, though Katrina could hear the grim understanding in his voice. Negative. Tommy tried to break through toward the county line. Last transmission was... Ghost's voice trailed off, and in the silence, Katrina heard everything she needed to know about Tommy Chen's fate. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows as a tactical team swept past her position, their night vision equipment and coordinated movement patterns speaking to training that went far beyond anything Blackwood Creek's Sheriff's Department should have possessed. These weren't local deputies anymore. They were professionals, probably military contractors, brought in specifically to handle a threat that Thorne had known was coming. Because someone had told him it was coming. Her radio crackled with a new voice, unfamiliar, speaking with authority that suggested command. All units be advised. Primary targets are contained within the festival perimeter. Maintain outer cordon, sweep inward systematically. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. These suspects are armed, dangerous, and have demonstrated willingness to endanger civilians. Katrina felt ice spreading through her veins as the implications hit home. Weapons-free. Shoot to kill. And somehow, the narrative had been crafted to paint them as the aggressors, the dangers to public safety that justified whatever violence was about to be unleashed. Ryder, she whispered into her headset, we need to get out of here. Now, before they complete their sweep pattern. Working on it, he replied, his voice tight with controlled desperation. But they've got us boxed in pretty tight. Only way out might be. His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of breaking glass and shouting. Katrina's blood ran cold as she heard Ryder's distinctive growl, followed by the meaty sounds of hand-to-hand combat, and then, silence. She was alone. 12:15 a.m., behind the games midway Katrina moved through the shadows between carnival games like a ghost, her father's training from childhood camping trips finally proving useful in ways Arthur never could have imagined. Move low, move quiet, trust your instincts, his voice echoed in her memory. The wilderness doesn't forgive carelessness, but it rewards patience. The festival grounds were quieter now, most of the families having been evacuated by emergency personnel who'd arrived with suspicious speed and efficiency. But she could still hear the systematic search pattern of Thorne's tactical teams, their radio chatter coordinating a net that was closing around her with methodical precision. She pressed herself against the back wall of a ring toss game, trying to think through options that all seemed to lead to capture or death. Her father's evidence had been broadcast for maybe 90 seconds. Before Thorne's, people cut the audio feed. Long enough for some truth to be heard, but not long enough to ensure its survival in the minds of people who'd been taught to distrust anything that challenged their comfortable assumptions about authority. A sound made her freeze, footsteps approaching, careful but not quite careful enough. She gripped the pistol Ryder had given her hours earlier, though she had no illusions about her ability to outduel professional soldiers in a firefight. Her weapons were intellect and desperation, not superior firepower. Katrina! The voice was familiar, but it took her a moment to place it through her adrenaline-hazed confusion. Marcus Rodriguez, slick, emerged from between two game booths, his face a mask of pain and something that might have been shame. "Slick," she breathed, relief flooding through her. "Thank God, I thought." She stopped speaking as she noticed the way he held himself, the positioning that kept his right hand free and ready, the way his eyes tracked the shadows around them not like someone seeking safety, but like someone ensuring privacy for an unpleasant conversation. "It was you," she said, the words emerging with the flat certainty of someone solving a puzzle she desperately hoped would remain unsolved. "You told them about the sound system, about the escape routes." Slick's face crumpled, the hardened biker facade falling away to reveal a broken father who'd sold his soul for his child's life. "Sophia's surgery is happening right now. In Seattle. The doctors say she's got a 90% chance if they caught it in time. Your daughter," understanding crashed over her like ice water. "Thorne used your daughter. She's 8 years old, Katrina. 8. She still believes her daddy can fix anything, protect her from anything." His voice broke, raw with pain and self-hatred. "She calls me her hero. How was I supposed to let her die to protect people she'll never meet?" Katrina stared at him, seeing not the traitor who destroyed their operation, but a father destroyed by an impossible choice between family and principle. It was a choice she'd never had to make, had never even considered having to make. What gave her the right to judge someone who'd been forced into territory she couldn't even imagine? "Where are they?" she asked quietly. "Ryder, Jax, the others?" "Alive," Slick replied, though something in his tone suggested that survival might be temporary. "Thorne wants them alive for questioning, wants to know about other cells, other evidence, other threats to his operation." "And me?" Slick's eyes met hers directly for the first time since he'd appeared, and what she saw there made her stomach clench with fear. "Webb wants you eliminated. Says you're too dangerous to interrogate, too connected to outside authorities. Says your death needs to look like you were killed while resisting arrest." She nodded slowly, pieces clicking into place. Marcus Webb, the courier she'd seen talking to Thorne, the representative of Sela's Vane's larger organization. He'd orchestrated all of this, the infiltration of her father's investigation, the corruption of local law enforcement, the systematic elimination of threats to the network that stretched far beyond Blackwood Creek. "So why are you warning me instead of just shooting me?" Slick was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. "Because Sophia asked me to bring her something from the festival, a prize from one of the games, something to remember her hometown by before." He gestured helplessly. "She still loves this place, even though it's killing her. Still believes in heroes and happy endings and fathers who keep their promises." He reached into his jacket, and Katrina tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small stuffed raven, a carnival prize that must have cost him considerable skill to win at the ring toss or dart throw games. She asked for a raven because they're smart, like her daddy taught her. Said ravens remember everything, even things people want to forget. His laugh was bitter. "Kid's smarter than her old man ever was." Katrina accepted the stuffed raven, its soft black fabric warm from his body heat. It was a simple thing, cheap and mass-produced, but in her hands it felt like something precious, a connection between a dying child and a town that had failed her in every possible way. "There's an old mining tunnel," Slick said, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the ongoing search. About half a mile east of here, past the old cemetery. Connects to the cave system that runs under Whisperwind Ridge, if you can reach it. What about your brothers? They're being held at the old mill complex. Heavy security, professional guards, no chance of a rescue operation. He met her eyes again, but Webb's moving them tomorrow night. Transportation to a more secure facility for intensive questioning. Katrina understood. Once Ryder and the others disappeared into Vane's network of secure facilities, they'd never be seen again. Whatever happened next would have to happen within the next 24 hours. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Slick was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd already started grieving for himself. "Because maybe if you survive this, if you find a way to bring them down, maybe Sophia will grow up in a world where other kids don't have to watch their parents make the kind of choices I've made." He stood, his movement careful and deliberate. "Or maybe I'm just hoping that somewhere in all this darkness, there's still room for something that looks like redemption." He disappeared back into the shadows between the game booths, leaving Katrina alone with a stuffed raven and the crushing weight of knowledge she had no idea how to use. Around her, the festival grounds continued their transformation from celebration to crime scene, while in the distance, searchlights swept across the landscape like lighthouse beams, seeking ships already run aground on hidden rocks. She looked down at the stuffed raven in her hands, thinking about an 8-year-old girl in a Seattle hospital room who still believed in heroes. Tomorrow night, Ryder and his remaining brothers would be moved to a place where heroes couldn't reach them. Unless someone was willing to become the kind of hero who operated outside the law, beyond mercy, in territories where justice was indistinguishable from vengeance. The mining tunnel Slick had mentioned was a lifeline, a chance to escape and perhaps find help from outside authorities. But following that path meant abandoning Ryder and the others to whatever fate awaited them in Vane's interrogation facilities. Katrina Vance, corporate lawyer and Arthur's daughter, would choose survival and the hope of eventual legal justice. But standing there in the ruins of their failed operation, clutching a stuffed raven that represented a child's faith in impossible things, she felt something else stirring within her, something harder and more desperate than the woman who'd returned to Blackwood Creek to settle her father's estate. She thought about her father's note. Sometimes the only way to stop a wildfire is to set a backfire. Maybe it was time to start a very different kind of fire. 1:33 a.m., abandoned mining tunnel. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Slick had said it would be, hidden behind a stand of overgrown mountain laurel that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Katrina squeezed through the narrow opening, her clothes catching on rough stone and rusted metal supports that spoke to the tunnel's age and abandonment. Inside, the air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and the faint echo of water moving through hidden channels. Her phone's flashlight revealed a passage that stretched beyond its illumination, carved from living rock by men who died long before the corruption that poisoned modern Blackwood Creek had even been imagined. She walked deeper into the mountain, following rough-cut walls that bore the tool marks of 19th-century miners, until the tunnel opened into a natural cavern that connected to the cave system Ryder had used during their escape from Arthur's bunker. The familiar landmarks oriented her. She was roughly 2 miles from town, beneath Whisperwind Ridge, in territory that Thorne's search teams would never think to explore. Safe, for now. She sat on a ledge that overlooked an underground stream, the sound of flowing water almost musical in the cavern's acoustic. The stuffed raven sat beside her, its button eyes reflecting her phone's light like tiny stars in the darkness. 24 hours. That's how long she had to find a way to save Ryder and his brothers, expose the network that had killed her father, and somehow survive long enough to see justice done. Against professional killers, corrupt law enforcement, and a criminal organization with resources that spanned multiple states. Her phone showed 2 bars of signal, enough to reach the outside world. She could call federal agents, request protective custody, provide testimony that might eventually lead to investigations and indictments, and the slow, careful process of legal justice. But legal justice moved at the speed of bureaucracy, and Ryder would be dead long before the first warrant was signed. She thought about Sofia Rodriguez, fighting for her life in a Seattle hospital room while her father's betrayal echoed through the mountain tunnels. About Emma Chen and all the other children who deserved to grow up in a Blackwood Creek free from the shadow of corruption. About her father's belief that sometimes good people had to be willing to pay terrible prices to protect things that mattered more than their own comfort. Her reflections stared back at her from the underground stream, Arthur's daughter, but also something newer and more dangerous. A woman who'd lost her faith in systems and institutions, who'd learned that sometimes the only law that mattered was the one you were willing to enforce yourself. The stuffed raven seemed to watch her as she made her choice, its button eyes witness to the moment when Katrina Vance stopped being a lawyer and became something else entirely. Something that might actually be dangerous enough to make Marcus Webb and Sheriff Thorne afraid. The mining tunnel stretched deeper into the mountain, following veins of ore and ancient watercourses that had been carved over millennia. Like the corruption in Blackwood Creek, the caverns were vast, interconnected, and far older than anyone still living could remember. But also like that corruption, they had weak points, places where the right pressure, applied at exactly the right moment, could bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. In the darkness beneath Whisperwind Ridge, with 24 hours until the people she'd come to love disappeared forever, Katrina Vance began to plan something that would either save them all or destroy whatever remained of her soul. Sometimes, she was beginning to understand, those were the same thing. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Begins. 6:47 a.m. underground cave system, Katrina's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. Federal task force established safe perimeter 20 miles south. Agent Sarah Chen requesting immediate contact. Your father's evidence package received and authenticated. We're coming. She stared at the screen in the blue glow of dawn filtering through cracks in the cave's ceiling. Help was coming, real help, with federal authority and resources that could finally challenge Vane's network. But coming wasn't fast enough. By the time Agent Chen's task force could navigate jurisdictional issues and establish operational protocols, Ryder and his men would be gone, disappeared into the shadow network that had swallowed so many others who dared to challenge the system. The stuffed raven sat beside her on the stone ledge, its button eyes seeming to ask the question she'd been avoiding all night. What kind of hero are you willing to become? She typed a response to Agent Chen, targets being moved today. Need immediate extraction at Old Mill Complex, but approach cautiously. Sheriff Thorne has professional contractors, military-grade equipment. This isn't local law enforcement anymore. The reply came quickly, understood. Federal warrants being expedited but need 4-6 hours minimum for tactical deployment. Can you maintain surveillance until then? 4 to 6 hours. Katrina looked at her watch. 6:50 a.m. If Slick's intelligence was accurate, the transfer would begin at sundown, roughly 12 hours. But something in her gut, honed by years of reading hostile witnesses and calculating opponent strategies, suggested the timeline might accelerate. Thorne was smart enough to know that holding high-value prisoners in a small town carried exponentially increasing risks with each passing hour. She made her decision. Negative on surveillance, moving to active intervention. If you want them alive, you'll need to move faster than bureaucracy allows. She turned off the phone before Agent Chen could respond with reasonable arguments about jurisdictional authority, proper procedures, and the dangers of civilian interference in federal operations. Those were arguments for a world where justice moved through proper channels, where evidence and testimony could safely wind their way through courts designed to protect the innocent. That world didn't exist in Blackwood Creek. Here, justice would have to be carved from harder stone, with tools that wouldn't be found in any law school curriculum. 8:15 a.m., Blackwood Creek town square the morning after the festival carried an unnatural quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Emergency vehicles had cleared away most of the debris from the previous night's chaos, but yellow police tape still fluttered around the carnival rides like prayer flags marking a battlefield. Shop owners swept broken glass from their storefronts while casting nervous glances toward the sheriff's station, where an unusual number of vehicles with tinted windows suggested that outside forces had indeed taken control of the situation. Katrina moved through the scene disguised by the simple expedient of looking like she belonged there. She traded her sophisticated lawyer's wardrobe for clothes borrowed from donations left in the cave system by previous users: work boots, faded jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Her auburn hair was hidden beneath a baseball cap advertising a tractor supply company, and the mirrored sunglasses concealed eyes that had learned to calculate violence with the same precision she'd once applied to corporate mergers. The transformation was more than cosmetic. The woman who'd returned to Blackwood Creek to settle her father's estate was gone, replaced by someone harder, more desperate, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone willing to operate in territories where the law was a luxury that civilized people couldn't always afford. Her first stop was Lara Bell's flower shop, where she hoped to find both information and assistance from the woman who'd been her father's closest ally. The shop was open despite the early hour, its windows bright with autumn blooms that seemed to mock the darkness that had settled over the town. Katrina, Lara's voice was barely above a whisper, her face pale with fear and something that might have been relief. "Dear God, child, everyone's saying you're dead, that you were killed in the fighting last night." "Not yet," Katrina replied, scanning the shop's interior for signs of surveillance equipment. "But I need your help, Lara. And I need to know if you're willing to risk everything for the chance to finally free this town." Lara's hands trembled as she deadheaded an arrangement of chrysanthemums, but her voice was steady. "Your father asked me the same question once. I told him then what I'll tell you now. I've been living in fear for 20 years. I'd rather die free than live as a slave. Then, I need you to do something that will either save us all or get us killed." Katrina pulled the stuffed raven from her jacket, setting it on the shop's counter, where its button eyes seemed to survey the flowers with grave attention. "I need you to spread word through the network of people my father trusted. Tell them to gather at the old mill complex at sunset. Tell them to bring cameras, phones, anything that can record what we're about to do." "What are we about to do?" Katrina's smile was sharp as broken glass. "We're going to hold an impromptu town meeting. A public hearing on the question of whether Blackwood Creek belongs to its citizens or to the criminals who have been feeding off it for decades." Lara stared at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "The mill complex is where they're holding Ryder and his men." "It'll be crawling with armed guards." "Exactly, which means it's the one place in town where the real decision makers will be gathered, where we can finally have an honest conversation about the future of this community. They'll kill you before you can say 10 words. Maybe. But they'll have to do it in front of witnesses, with cameras rolling, while federal agents are racing to establish jurisdiction." Katrina picked up the stuffed raven, feeling its soft weight like a promise made to a dying child. "Sometimes the most effective legal argument isn't made in a courtroom, Lara. Sometimes it's made in front of a jury of your peers, with the whole world watching." 2:30 p.m. Abandoned church. Whisperwind Ridge. The meeting place Lara had chosen was perfect. A small wooden church that had been abandoned when Blackwood Creek's last independent pastor had been forced out by financial pressures years earlier. Hidden in a grove of ancient oaks, it was invisible from the road but accessible through hiking trails that true locals knew by heart. Katrina arrived to find nearly 40 people already gathered in the pews that still smelled faintly of incense and old wood. She recognized some faces from the festival, others from childhood memories, but all of them carried the same expression of desperate hope mixed with bone-deep fear. These were Arthur's people, shopkeepers who'd been systematically squeezed by protection rackets, farmers forced to sell their land to shell companies at below-market prices, teachers whose classrooms had been underfunded, while certain contractor friends of the sheriff received lucrative maintenance contracts. They were the invisible victims of corruption, people who'd learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut because speaking truth carried consequences too terrible to contemplate. But tonight, Katrina realized as she looked out over their faces, they were ready to break their silence. "You all know who I am," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the church's acoustic. "And you know what happened to my father when he tried to speak truth about what's been done to this town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the small congregation. In the front pew, she saw Mrs. Henderson from the post office, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. Beside her sat Tommy Chen's parents, their faces etched with grief for a son who died trying to free his community from oppression. "What some of you may not know," Katrina continued, "is that Arthur spent 20 years documenting every crime, every payoff, every violent act committed by Sheriff Thorne and his network. That evidence is now in federal hands, and before this week is over, everyone responsible for turning Blackwood Creek into their personal criminal empire will be facing federal charges." The murmur grew louder, tinged with excitement and disbelief. "But tonight," Katrina said, her voice rising, "we have a choice to make. We can wait for federal agents to slowly, carefully, bureaucratically process their cases while good people sit in unmarked graves and the criminals who killed them walk free. Or we can take back our town right now, with our own hands, in full view of the world." "How?" The question came from Dr. Patricia Miles, the pediatric oncologist who'd been treating Sofia Rodriguez, her face drawn with fatigue and moral complexity. "By confronting them directly, by demanding answers, by refusing to be silent while they decide the fate of people we care about behind closed doors and armed guards." Katrina pulled out her phone, showing them the video recording function. "Every phone in this room is a television camera. Every social media account is a news network. If we document what happens tonight, if we broadcast it live to the world, then whatever they do to us, they'll have to do it in the light." "They'll kill us," someone said from the back of the church. "Maybe," Katrina agreed, "but they'll have to do it while federal agents are watching, while news outlets are recording, while their own community is finally speaking truth about what they've become. And that kind of truth, once spoken, can never be completely silenced again." She looked out over the faces, men and women who'd spent years in fear, who'd watched their town die by inches while telling themselves that someone else would fix it, that proper authorities would eventually intervene, that good people just had to wait patiently for justice to arrive through official channels. "I won't lie to you," she said. "What I'm proposing is dangerous. Some of us might not survive it. But the alternative is to let them continue destroying everything we claim to love about this place. To let Ryder Blackwood and his men disappear into the night. To let my father's death mean nothing." She paused, letting the words settle into the silence that had fallen over the small congregation. "I'm going to the old mill complex at sunset. I'm going to demand the release of the prisoners. I'm going to read Arthur's evidence aloud, name by name, crime by crime, until everyone in Blackwood Creek knows exactly what's been done in their name." She held up her phone. "And I'm going to broadcast every word, every response, every action that follows." The silence stretched longer, broken only by the sound of wind through the old church's rafters. Then Mrs. Henderson stood up, her voice quavering but determined. "I'll be there. My herald served in Vietnam so this town could be free. I won't let his sacrifice be for nothing." Dr. Miles stood next, her face resolved despite the tremor in her hands. "I've treated too many children hurt by this system. It ends tonight." One by one, others rose from the pews, shopkeepers and farmers, teachers and mechanics, parents and grandparents who'd finally reached the point where fear of action was outweighed by the shame of continued inaction. Not all of them, not even half, but enough. Enough to turn a desperate last stand into something that looked like democracy in action. As the meeting dispersed into the afternoon light, Katrina felt the weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked for but couldn't refuse. In her pocket, the stuffed raven seemed to pulse with the faith of a child who still believed heroes existed in the world. Tonight, she would find out if Sofia Rodriguez's faith was justified, or if heroes were just another lie adults told children to help them sleep at night. 5:45 p.m., Old Mill Complex. The complex looked like a fortress in the dying light, its perimeter secured by professional guards who moved with the efficiency of military contractors. Floodlights had been erected around the main buildings, turning the area into a stage where shadows were banished and every movement would be visible to watching eyes. Katrina approached from the north, walking openly down the access road with her phone held high, its screen showing the live video feed she'd started broadcasting 15 minutes earlier. Behind her, at carefully staggered intervals, came the volunteers from the church, perhaps 20 people total, each carrying their own recording device, each one a witness to whatever was about to unfold. "This is Katrina Vance," she spoke into her phone's microphone, her voice steady despite the fear that made her hands tremble. "Daughter of Arthur Vance, lawyer and citizen of Blackwood Creek. It's 5:47 p.m. on October 15th, and I'm approaching the old mill complex where Sheriff Gideon Thorne is holding prisoners without charges, without due process, and without legal authority." The guards at the perimeter had spotted them now, speaking urgently into radio headsets while taking positions that suggested they were prepared for violence. But they hadn't opened fire yet, probably because of the cameras, possibly because even professional killers had limits on what they were willing to do in full public view. "I demand the immediate release of Ryder Blackwood and his associates," Katrina continued, her voice carrying across the complex through a portable amplifier one of the volunteers had brought. "I demand a public accounting of the crimes committed in this community by Sheriff Thorne and his associates. And I demand that the people of Blackwood Creek be allowed to decide for themselves what kind of town they want to live in." She stopped 50 yards from the main gate, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough to avoid being immediately overwhelmed by security forces. Behind her, the volunteers spread out in a loose semicircle, their phones and cameras creating a constellation of recording devices that turned the confrontation into a multimedia event. For a moment, nothing happened. The guards maintained their positions, the floodlights hummed in the gathering dusk, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Sheriff Gideon Thorne emerged from the main building, flanked by two men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of authority that didn't need uniforms or badges. Marcus Webb and another representative of Vane's organization, Katrina, realized. The real power behind Blackwood Creek's corruption finally forced into the open. "Vance," Thorne called, his voice amplified by speakers that had been quickly set up. "You're trespassing on a secure law enforcement facility. Disperse immediately or face arrest." "Under what authority?" Katrina shot back, her voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "You're not conducting law enforcement, Sheriff. You're operating a kidnapping and murder enterprise on behalf of organized crime. And tonight, the people of Blackwood Creek are going to hear the truth about what you've done." She pulled out a tablet computer, holding it high enough for the cameras to see. "This contains 20 years of evidence compiled by my father before you murdered him. Bank records, surveillance photographs, recorded conversations, everything needed to prove that you've been operating as an agent of the Vane criminal organization, using your badge to cover crimes that include money laundering, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and murder." A murmur ran through the small crowd of volunteers, but their cameras remained steady, their recordings continuing. Whatever happened next would be preserved, documented, and broadcast to a world that was finally watching Blackwood Creek with the attention it deserved. The reckoning had begun, and for the first time since Arthur Vance's death, the truth was being spoken with the full light of day shining on it. In her pocket, the stuffed raven seemed to whisper that some promises, once made to dying children, had to be kept regardless of the cost. Chapter 10. The Storm Breaks. 6:02 p.m., Old Mill Complex. The silence stretched across the complex like a held breath, broken only by the hum of floodlights and the distant sound of highway traffic carrying the outside world's indifference to Blackwood Creek's moment of reckoning. Katrina stood 50 yards from the main gate, her tablet held high, 20 years of her father's evidence displayed on its screen for the cameras that surrounded her like electronic witnesses to history. Sheriff Gideon Thorne studied her through the chain-link fence, his face a mask that concealed whatever calculations were running behind his eyes. Beside him, Marcus Webb shifted impatiently, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of what should have been a simple elimination operation. The third man, someone Katrina didn't recognize, but whose expensive suit and predatory stillness marked him as hierarchy from Vane's organization, spoke quietly into a satellite phone, his words too low to be heard, but his body language radiating authority and annoyance. "Last warning, Ms. Vance," Thorne called, his amplified voice carrying across the complex. "Disperse now or face the consequences of interfering with a federal law enforcement operation." "Federal?" Katrina's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Show me your federal authorization, Sheriff. Show me the warrants, the jurisdiction, the legal authority that justifies holding American citizens without charges or due process." She gestured to her tablet, then to the cameras recording everything. "Because what I have here is 20 years of documentation proving that you've been operating as a criminal enterprise masquerading as law enforcement. And tonight, the world is going to see exactly what that looks like." Behind her, Dr. Patricia Miles stepped forward, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd spent years treating the victims of systematic oppression. "I've documented 17 cases of children injured by your protection rackets, Sheriff. 17 families destroyed because they couldn't or wouldn't pay tribute to your organization. My restaurant was burned down when we couldn't make our payments," called another voice from the crowd. "My insurance claim was denied because the fire was ruled suspicious circumstances. My husband was beaten so badly he never worked again," said an elderly woman whose hands shook as she held her phone's camera steady. "All because he asked questions about why our property taxes kept going up while services kept getting cut." One by one, voices rose from the small crowd of witnesses, testimonies that had been whispered in secret for decades, now spoken aloud with cameras rolling and the world watching. The litany of abuse was devastating not just for its scope, but for the casual, systematic way it revealed how corruption had poisoned every aspect of community life. Thorne's facade began to crack as the testimonies continued, his face flushing with anger or perhaps something that might have been shame, but it was Webb who finally snapped. "Enough of this circus," he snarled into his radio. "All units, weapons free, eliminate the primary target and disperse the crowd." The guards raised their weapons with professional precision, but before they could fire, a new voice cut through the tension, young, scared, but absolutely certain. "Daddy?" Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. A small figure had appeared at the edge of the floodlit area, a young girl in a hospital gown, IV stand beside her, supported by a man whose face was etched with desperate hope and crushing guilt. Marcus Rodriguez, Slick, had brought his daughter to witness the confrontation he'd helped orchestrate. "Sophia," he said, his voice breaking. "Sweetheart, you should be in the hospital." "I heard you talking to the doctor," she replied, her 8-year-old voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "You said you had to choose between saving me and saving your brothers, but Daddy, you taught me that crows don't abandon family, any family." She turned toward Katrina, her eyes bright with the kind of absolute faith that adults spent lifetimes trying to recapture. "Are you the lady who's trying to help my daddy's friends?" Katrina knelt down, pulling the stuffed raven from her pocket and holding it out to the dying child. "I am, and this belongs to you." Sophia took the stuffed animal, clutching it against her chest as she looked around at the armed guards, the floodlights, the cameras recording her every word. "Daddy says heroes aren't real. But I think maybe he's wrong." The words hit the assembled crowd like lightning, transforming the moment from political confrontation to something far more primal, a community finally seeing itself reflected in the eyes of a child whose faith had survived everything the adults had tried to destroy. Slick stepped forward, his face streaming with tears he'd held back for months. "Sheriff Thorne," he called, his voice carrying across the complex with surprising strength. "I gave you everything you asked for. I betrayed my brothers, sold my soul, became everything I swore I'd never be. And for what? So you could threaten my daughter's life to control me, so you could turn a father's love into a weapon against the only family he'd ever known." He pulled out his phone, holding it up so the cameras could see its screen. "This is a recording of Marcus Webb threatening Sophia's medical care if I didn't cooperate." This is evidence that you used a child's cancer as leverage to destroy the crows from within. Webb lunged toward Slick, but the damage was already done. The recording was broadcasting live to thousands of viewers, uploaded simultaneously to multiple platforms, documented by dozens of cameras held by witnesses who would never again be silenced by threats or intimidation. "You son of a bitch," Webb snarled, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking completely. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? What Mr. Vane will do to you for this betrayal?" "I know exactly what I've done," Slick replied, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "I've chosen to be the man my little girl thinks I am, instead of the coward you turned me into." That's when the helicopters appeared. 6:15 p.m., federal intervention, 3 helicopters swept in from the south, their rotors churning the evening air as they took positions around the complex. Federal agents repelled from the aircraft with tactical precision, establishing a perimeter that encompassed both the mill complex and the civilian witnesses with equal protection. Agent Sarah Chen's voice crackled through speakers as her team moved into position. "This is the FBI. Federal warrants have been issued for the arrest of Sheriff Gideon Thorne, Marcus Webb, and associates on charges including racketeering, conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. All weapons will be lowered immediately." Thorne stared at the federal agents surrounding his position, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the delusions of invincibility he'd cultivated over decades. His empire, built on fear and maintained through violence, was crumbling in real time while cameras broadcast its collapse to the world. "You don't understand," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate pleading. "The system, it's bigger than Blackwood Creek, bigger than me. Vane has people everywhere, federal judges, senators, prosecutors. You think arresting me will change anything?" "Maybe not," Katrina replied, approaching the fence that separated them. "But it's a start, and sometimes that's enough." She held up her tablet one final time, the screen displaying a photograph that had been the centerpiece of her father's investigation, Sheriff Thorne pushing Arthur Vance off the bridge, his face clearly visible in the headlights of his truck. "This is murder, Sheriff. Cold-blooded, premeditated murder. And now everyone in Blackwood Creek knows exactly what you are." Thorne stared at the photograph, his face cycling through emotions too complex to categorize: rage, fear, despair, and something that might have been relief. The weight of 25 years of compromises, of choices that had seemed justifiable at the time but had accumulated into something monstrous, finally seemed to be settling on his shoulders. "I was 19 years old," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone listening. 19 years old and desperate enough to believe that desperation justified anything. He looked up at the cameras, at the faces of townspeople who'd lived under his shadow for decades, at the child whose innocent faith had somehow become the catalyst for his downfall. "I killed a federal agent when I was 19, he continued, his voice gaining strength as the confession poured out of him. "Not because I wanted to, but because Vane's father told me it was the only way to survive. And every choice I've made since then, every compromise, every act of violence. It was all to avoid facing the consequences of that first terrible decision." The confession was devastating not just for its content, but for the way it revealed the human cost of systematic corruption, how it turned frightened teenagers into monsters, how it perpetuated itself through fear and complicity, how it destroyed everyone it touched, including those who seemed to benefit from its protection. Webb tried to interrupt, to regain control of a narrative that was spinning completely beyond anyone's ability to manage, but federal agents were already moving to arrest him. His expensive suit and corporate authority meant nothing in the face of evidence that had been broadcast live to thousands of witnesses. "It's over, Marcus," Thorne said, looking at his handler with something approaching pity. "Tell Vane that Blackwood Creek is done paying tribute to his empire. Tell him that sometimes the only way to stop a wildfire is to let it burn everything down and start over." 7:30 p.m., Old Mill Complex. The complex had been transformed into a federal crime scene, with evidence teams documenting everything while paramedics treated prisoners who'd been released from the holding cells. Ryder emerged into the floodlit evening supported by 2 agents, his face battered but his eyes clear and determined. Katrina ran to him, abandoning the professional composure she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. Their embrace was fierce, desperate, weighted with the knowledge of how close they'd come to losing everything that mattered. "Sophia?" Ryder asked, looking around until he spotted the little girl sitting on a medical gurney while doctors checked her condition. "She's the reason any of this worked," Katrina replied. "Her faith in heroes. It reminded everyone what we were fighting for." They walked together toward the child who'd somehow become the moral center of their revolution. Sophia looked up at them with the solemn gravity that serious illness had forced upon her young features, but her smile was bright with satisfaction. "Did we win?" she asked. Katrina and Ryder exchanged a look weighted with all they'd witnessed, all they'd learned about the costs of victory and the complexity of justice. The system that had nearly destroyed Blackwood Creek wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Vane's network extended far beyond one corrupt sheriff, and the federal investigation would likely take years to unravel all the connections. Some wounds would heal, others would leave permanent scars, and the work of creating something better would require constant vigilance. But tonight, for the first time in decades, Blackwood Creek's children could go to sleep without fear. Tonight, truth had been spoken in the light instead of whispered in shadows. Tonight, a community had remembered that democracy wasn't something that happened to them, it was something they could choose to create. "Yes, sweetheart," Katrina said, sitting beside Sophia on the gurney. "We won." Sophia nodded solemnly, then held up the stuffed raven that had somehow become the symbol of their unlikely victory. "Ravens remember everything," she said, "even things people want to forget. And now everyone will remember that heroes are real." Above them, the sky had filled with actual ravens, dozens of them, perched on power lines and fence posts, watching the scene below with intelligent eyes. 7 cause for murder, as old Ezra Blackthorne had said. But tonight the birds were silent, their vigil finally ended. The storm had broken. The truth had been spoken. And in the growing darkness, Blackwood Creek began the long, difficult work of learning how to be free. Epilogue, 1 week later. Agent Sarah Chen's preliminary report would eventually run to over 300 pages, documenting a criminal enterprise that had operated for nearly 3 decades across multiple states. Sheriff Gideon Thorne had been formally charged with 17 counts including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Marcus Webb and his associates faced federal prosecution under RICO statutes that could result in life sentences. Silas Vane himself remained a shadow, his existence confirmed by financial records and testimony, but his physical location still unknown. The investigation continued, following money trails and communication intercepts across an international network that made Blackwood Creek's corruption look like a neighborhood crime ring by comparison. But in Blackwood Creek itself, something fundamental had changed. The town's first truly democratic election in decades was scheduled for the following month. Federal oversight would ensure that whoever was elected would serve the community rather than criminal interests. And slowly, carefully, the work of rebuilding began. Sofia Rodriguez's surgery had been successful, her bone marrow transplant showing promising early results. She would face years of treatment and recovery, but her doctors were cautiously optimistic. More importantly, she would grow up in a Blackwood Creek where children's medical care wasn't held hostage by political considerations. Marcus "Slick" Rodriguez faced prosecution for his role in the conspiracy, but federal prosecutors were considering a plea arrangement in exchange for his continued cooperation. His betrayal of his brothers had been forgiven, if not forgotten. The Crows understood the impossible choice he'd been forced to make, and Sophia's courage had somehow redeemed his darkest moment. And in the Vance homestead, restored to its former dignity with community volunteers and federal victim assistance funds, Katrina established her law practice with a mission that would have made Arthur proud. Vance and Associates, Justice for All, specialized in cases that larger firms wouldn't touch, protecting the powerless, challenging corruption, and ensuring that the shadows never again grew long enough to swallow the light. The stuffed raven sat on her desk, a reminder that some promises transcended law books and courtroom procedures. Sometimes justice required more than legal arguments. Sometimes it required ordinary people willing to become heroes, if only for a moment, if only when the alternative was letting darkness win. The ravens still gathered in Blackwood Creek, but now they came as witnesses to renewal rather than guardians of secrets. And in their patient watching, the town remembered that freedom was not a gift to be received, but a choice to be made, again and again, by people brave enough to speak truth in the face of power. The storm had broken. The reckoning was complete, and for the first time in decades, Blackwood Creek could face the future with clean hands and clear conscience, knowing that its children would inherit something worth protecting.
Thank you for listening to the Soundscape Books recording of Crow's Revenge, a crime thriller written by Vivian Black. We hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe so you don't miss our new releases. Goodbye for now.